to the Kent Lapp Podcast.
Well, great. Well, Matthew Hawkins, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you,
This is
Kent.
quite a pleasure.
Appreciate
Really
it.
looking forward to this one.
Likewise.
Happy Father's Day.
Happy Father's Day to you.
Yeah, thank you. Now you have, I know, at least one child.
Just one.
Okay.
Maggie Jo.
Okay.
Is our first. We did experience a couple miscarriages
Oh, no.
before
Sorry
Maggie
to hear
Jo.
that. Yeah.
That's okay. We try to be able to talk about it.
Yeah.
When we can, to encourage others who
Yeah.
have gone through that kind of situation.
Yeah.
But Maggie Jo is our gem so far.
How
So
old is she?
She is 4 years old. Just turned 4 2 days before
Oh,
we're
wow.
recording this.
Okay, wonderful.
So she's a delightful age.
Yeah, we have someone turning 4 in like the next month, I think, in the next couple months.
Fun ages.
Did I see properly on, I think it was maybe your Twitter, that you almost didn't make it past the age of 40?
That's correct.
Your wife saved your life? You were having a heart attack?
In a
Is that
way.
right? What happened?
Yeah, at the age of 40, I had a heart attack. I don't look the stereotypical cardiac patient.
No, you don't. You don't even look 40.
Right?
You hear that a lot?
I do
assume?
hear that a lot. Yeah.
Okay.
Most people think I'm like 30.
I'd say
or in my
32.
30s. Yeah. Especially if I shave. Like,
Right.
If I took the time to grow out your kind of beard,
Right.
maybe
You get
maybe
37, maybe?
yeah,
Yeah.
it'd be different. But that would take me 2 years to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, youngish looks, not overweight, not a smoker, but genetics plus stress are not a great combination. And I learned that, thankfully, not as much of a hard way as it could have been, but turned out I had what they call the Widowmaker blockage, which is it's in your lower anterior. And sure enough, I had about a 99% blockage. Now, the details of this are that the short of it is that I don't present symptomatically like textbook. And so I was having unusual symptoms, but your top 5 or 6 descriptors of what they tell you to look for a heart attack.
Yeah.
None of those were there.
Really?
I had some sensation in my chest, but I wouldn't describe it as painful. It wasn't debilitating. But the short of it is, after a couple days, frankly, of weird symptoms, I was walking on my, what was then a very normal Washington, D.C. commute to the bus stop, which I would take to the metro. Okay. And about halfway to the bus, I felt a pressure that was like dead center in my chest. The previous day, it happened 3 times, also while I was walking. That was more broad. It was like someone was inflating a balloon inside my chest. But once it was like narrow and kind of dead center in my chest, I thought, this is not a good sensation.
Almost like if someone was pushing on your chest, or
it
like
was
a weight on your chest?
It was kind of that same kind of balloon inflation, except it was more precise, like right dead center instead of my entire chest cavity. And at that point I thought, still not really convinced that, it was heart related necessarily. Thought maybe, indigestion or, dehydration. It was May, it was hot. Humid.
Okay.
And I thought, this is fine. I'll go inside and rest. So thankfully I didn't, I did have this kind of like fork in the road moment where I thought maybe it's not a good day to get on public transportation right now.
So you did a 180 and went back towards the house?
Yeah, I went back towards the house, and my wife, she's a nurse practitioner. One of the insane blessings of my life is that I married a medical professional. Yeah. And she listened to my heart with a stethoscope, and she wasn't sure what was going on, but she knew it was abnormal enough and that she didn't like it. So she said, we're going to the ER.
What time of the day is this?
It was morning. It was commuting hour. And I had a work phone call on the way to the hospital. Like, I was feeling fine. Because once I would stop exerting myself, the symptoms would subside.
Oh, interesting.
And went to the ER. And again, I don't present like a heart attack patient. The ER doctor initially thought indigestion, prescribed me some Maalox that I took there while we were thankfully waiting for the blood test that they give you to see if they're enzymes.
Did they do an EKG
actives.
right away?
They didn't do it right away.
They took a blood test.
But they took a blood test that measures an enzyme called troponin. And I think they may have... But yeah, they didn't put me on a monitor yet. Now, we'd gone to a walk-in clinic the evening before. They had diagnosed an arrhythmia. but it wasn't anything that appeared emergent, more than like schedule an appointment with a cardiologist next week. And so we were still waiting for that result. But once they saw that troponin level it be increasing, which basically it's an enzyme that's released and it's not in your bloodstream unless heart muscle is deteriorating, is how it was explained to me. So that's like a surefire diagnosis of you're having a heart event. And we were seated. It was a busy day at the ER. We were kind of seated around from the nursing station, and we saw the nurse take the report back to the doc, and we heard the doctor like open, we watched the doctor from a distance open the report and say, "Oh,
no way."
Yeah, because she wasn't, thinking that it was a heart attack, but they saw that troponin level, and within I'm not sure what the timeline was from there, but they got me in a bag, got me on EKG.
Wow. And, how soon is your chest open?
Certainly within 2 hours, I think. I'm not sure how.
Same hospital, or did you
same
transfer?
Hospital. No, same hospital. Virginia Hospital Center up in Arlington. And which we had been there for a number of things before, kind of a hub of our healthcare at the time. And they took real good care of me. Dropped a stent up through my wrist, into my threaded it up into my heart. And
what do you mean? They put a stent in your wrist?
Well, they used to. The traditional way to do it was through an artery or a vein. Pardon me, doctors. I'm going to get this terminology correct, but they would go up through a spot in your groin you'd thread the stent up to your heart through that way. But it's advanced to the point now where they can do it in your wrist.
This little stent goes in your wrist, in the blood vessel or whatever,
like a fishing line,
all the way through your shoulder into. Why don't they? But why don't they cut the blood vessel open by the heart and just put the stent in and repatch it?
Well, that's invasive. Sorry, that's invasive.
You're saying you got this fixed without your chest getting cut open?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
It's an unbelievable. Wow. I mean, it was basically. I mean, I stayed overnight, but I was released by Friday. This happened on a Thursday morning. I was released by Friday dinner time.
No cuts in your chest. They did not.
None.
So they cut into your wrist, put the stent in, and fish it into where it needs to be, and call it good, and somehow keep it there.
Yeah. So it's a highly, it's kind of an over-engineered piece of metal. I've got a picture of it in my wallet if you want to see it. But it's like a mesh tube. You remember those? What do they call it? Chinese finger traps or something? When we were kids.
Do you have your wallet on you?
I do.
Can I see the picture?
So it's compressed, and then when it gets to the right spot, of course they're watching it through. I guess it's radiology technology. So I actually woke up once and kind of saw the image on the screen, moving.
Were you not supposed to be awake?
No, I mean they knock you out. And they, it's funny. They ask you what music you want to listen to. Of course, that's on your way out. And then I woke up, I was like, this is not the music. So it's clearly the surgeons change it when you're...
You're like, this guy's out. Let's change it back to...
I woke up one time, and actually I thought it was pretty cool to watch, but your wrist is kind of pinned down and kind of torqued a little bit in such a way that it was just uncomfortable. So I was like, knock me out, guys.
Yeah. What is happening at this place where they put the stent in? What is happening? Has a blood vessel collapsed, or has too much LDL built up?
It doesn't have a picture on here now. I'll have to look it up on my phone. But that's the spot, if you want to see it. It's the lower interior. So what happens, the theory...
What are we looking at here? There's your heart, obviously.
X marks the spot.
Right there.
Is where my stent is. I can bring up a picture for you here.
And is the blood vessel at that point, is it collapsing, or has it plugged? Or
so this is kind of
oh my goodness.
But this is like, millimeters wide.
It looks like a slide that's circular, like a kid's slide that's plastic, but instead of the plastic, like wire mesh almost, and then much tinier.
That's kind of a better image of it.
So I thought that we would be looking at a solid tube.
No, it's a mesh thing.
Just to keep the...
Yeah, just keeps the vessel open. And so what it was explained to me is basically the theory. It's hard to diagnose these things retroactively. But I had probably built up a 20 to 30% blockage in my 20s and 30s. And then combination of illness, stress, it basically destabilizes the plaque. And then that destabilization, the plaque collapses on itself like a cave. That creates the blockage. So it's not like a linear growth of plaque inside the bloodstream. It grows over time.
And then there's an event
or
something.
Or, successive events that destabilize it, and that collapses on itself and cause my particular issue.
Do you have any idea what the event or events were that may have... Is it generally stress or is it generally physical movement related?
Right. I think it's a combination of different things. It turns out I have my dad and myself, our lineage, we have heart disease that runs in the family.
Okay.
Dig a few layers deep. I now know, after the fact, we now both know. My dad and I had heart attacks within 3 years of each other. He's happened in his 60s. So I knew that kind of thing was on the horizon.
Oh, okay. Got it. You and your dad had heart attacks within 3 years of each other. He didn't have one when he was in his 40s.
Right.
Okay.
So, anyway, what we now know also is our particular bodies cling to LDL, the bad cholesterol, like white on rice. And so it's wise for us to take some extra precautions to keep our LDL lower, even than would be normally recommended.
Yeah.
For men of a certain age.
Interesting. So. The way our family nurse practitioner explained HDL and LDL to me a couple years ago was HDL is kind of like a train, and LDL is like the bad baggage, if you will, and it needs to get on the HDL to move through the system. So you want enough of HDL to carry the LDL, the bad stuff, through, because not all cholesterol is bad. HDL is good, LDL is bad.
Right. Yeah.
And so having a high, because my cholesterol was a little higher than normal, but thankfully it was more the HDL. So apparently it wasn't that big a deal.
Yeah. You want HDL to be good or high.
Yeah.
And it turns out what I'm learning is so you can take meds and you can work on your diet to decrease the LDL. The bad, but you cannot take meds to increase the good cholesterol, the HDL.
Oh,
the only thing that
increases
is through physical activity.
Really?
Exercise, yeah.
To increase HDL?
To increase HDL.
It's physical activity. Now, are you...
Getting the heart rate up.
Interesting. So is that good for you, or do you have to be careful? If you get your heart rate up too much, that might cause a problem? Or no,
it's good. Now I'm on a battery of, they call them cardioprotective meds. So it's still, I'm 2 years out, but it's still kind of a rudimentary thing that number one keeps my blood slick like oil, running through the bloodstream, and reduces the load on my heart. So I'm on beta blockers, I'm on blood pressure medicine, and frankly, the beta blocker is actually frustrating to me because I can't get my heart rate up where I ordinarily would. To try to get, so I'm cleared for, heart rate of 150 or more. After a lengthy time of rehab, which a year ago I was not even close to what I can do now. But by the grace of God and my wife being on me and a lot of home workouts, I feel a lot different than I did. Even a year ago, even a year and a half ago. So more normal. But things like beta blockers and blood pressure meds. If you're doing burpees or things that you jump elevation, you change elevation, blood pressure stuff can make you lightheaded more than normal. So that's annoying.
Interesting.
The beta blockers just kind of keep my heart rate lower than they typically would be. And I'm sure the medical community is saying that you're not explaining it right.
Yeah, but it almost works against you. It almost works against if you're going to be exercising, you want to get your heart rate up.
Exactly.
And the beta blocker saying, no, don't do that.
Exactly.
And so you've got that.
So that's been a little point of personal frustration for me. But, my cardiologist explained, as long as you're doing the exercise for that period of time, my heart's still getting the benefit of the workout, say at 130 beats per minute, that it would at 150 beats per minute.
Yeah.
The point is the exercise. The point isn't necessarily the particular heart rate.
I see. Yeah, it makes sense. Go ahead. Did I?
No, I was good because that was my big question a while back. I was like, I can't get my heart sustained this high. This is what But those those recommended heart rates, those are kind of very generalized.
I see.
For the population. So you kind of got to figure out what's good for your heart rate in my particular condition, and given the meds I'm on and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Have you tried sauna?
What's that?
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Okay, you might want to look into sauna. Basically a hot box that you sit in.
a sauna.
Yeah, a sauna.
I thought you were talking about like a name brand something.
Oh no, just sauna.
Yeah,
a sauna.
A sauna.
Did the
we call that Tennessee summer.
Well, yeah, I think it's well, not this year, interestingly enough, but maybe it's coming. But did any of your doctors or healthcare people recommend using sauna?
They have not.
Okay, I'm sort of surprised about that. Yeah. Although I think it's an emerging thing. I was watching a YouTube video the other day from Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who is a big proponent of using sauna 3 times a week, or if better yet, 7 times a week. And apparently it's a huge thing in Finland. I didn't realize this until literally the last week. But the reason I'm looking into it is because I recently got a DNA test from Jamie Aurora with Hopewell Family Care, where we go in Old Hickory. And because I've been battling just gut issues and general health things, and just we'd like to get to the bottom of it. So we got a DNA test, and based on my DNA, one of the things that would be helpful for me is jumping in a sauna a couple of times a week. Yeah. And so we don't have a sauna. Home saunas is now becoming a lot more popular. They're $1 to $2 to $3 grand. And I think it's the awareness is rising in America, but where I was going with this earlier, it's been used for a couple thousand years in Finland, and right now 1 in 3 people actively use sauna in Finland. Like 1 in 3. That's amazing to me, because I don't know what it would be in America. 1 in 30.
So the Frozen movies are accurate.
Maybe, although I don't know what you're referencing there, because it's been a while since I've seen Frozen. I don't have the.
It's a character that has a sauna.
Oh, really? Are you talking about the movie Frozen?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You do have a 4-year-old daughter, I guess. You're probably a little bit more up on that.
I'm up on it, honestly.
Yeah, but what sauna does is it enlarges, it enlarges all your blood vessels and veins, and it really increases circulation. So I wonder if it would be something you'd want to consider. It's
possible, but I'll take it up with my cardiologist, because
that would be key.
Anytime I've been in a sauna, they're always warning if you're on blood pressure medicines.
Really?
Cautious about it.
Interesting.
You could probably depressurize a little too much.
I see.
Actually, blood pressure is not my particular issue. It's the cholesterol.
Gotcha.
That's my issue. I'm on blood pressure meds as kind of a general.
I see.
Protective function.
Where does your wife practice?
Vanderbilt.
Oh wow. Yeah. Okay. She drives in from Lebanon.
She does.
Okay.
Although hopefully. Not for much longer.
Okay.
So she's at Vanderbilt Surgical and Medical Weight Loss Center. She's a nurse practitioner.
Okay.
She actually graduated as a nurse practitioner from Vanderbilt several years ago. So she's been doing the nurse practitioner thing for at least a decade now.
Wow.
And so she loves her job over there. Highly recommend it. It's over at the 100 Oaks location. It's not at Vanderbilt proper. But last year, Vanderbilt bought the Wilson County Hospital, formerly Tenova. So we expect a lot of Vanderbilt clinics to be moving out that direction.
I see. So, How long have you lived in Lebanon?
2 years.
Okay.
Not even that at this point.
Really? Mm-hmm. Wow. And you moved in from D.C.?
We moved here. Yeah, we moved into Lebanon. We moved into Lebanon from D.C.
Okay.
But my wife was she was born in Lebanon. She grew up in Franklin. I lived here in Nashville for 14 years.
Okay.
So it was like homecoming for us mainly. Lebanon was a new thing residentially for us, but her family is kind of thick on the ground in Wilson County. So we're close to in-laws.
So you knew when you moved there that it's Lebanon, not Lebanon.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
We moved to we moved to Mount Juliet in 2014. Yeah, 2014. Uh-huh. And it took 3 or 4 people to be like, no, it's not Lebanon. It's Lebanon. Right. And finally we got it. Because you mentioned stress, did you make any career changes or other changes based on this issue then? That's a
good question. The ironic thing was that the heart attack happened actually after we made the decision to leave DC. And so the heart attack happened in May. The previous spring, winter and spring, I was weighing some different job opportunities and options. And we just felt, for a lot of different reasons, it was time to leave DC. We've ultimately concluded that if it's 8 years is good enough for a president, it's good enough for us. Yeah. And so we decided to escape the Beltway.
Okay.
And so we had made that decision, gosh, I don't know, certainly by April, maybe as early as March, cognitively. I think Crystal was already searching out job opportunities down here at that time. And so we knew we were leaving DC and probably by the summer's end. So like the wheels were in motion and it was no real surprise. And so the heart attack came and it was like, God, we don't need this. We know we're leaving.
Right.
We don't need.
Could have saved it for later.
We don't need the underscore or the italics here.
Right. Maybe you did.
Maybe we did, but so all to say, it was we were already on the cusp of making that job and career change and that lifestyle change.
Okay.
To come back to Tennessee and Lebanon and do some other things. So the heart attack was more or less kind of a confirming thing that we were doing the right thing.
So would you have felt that with your role there in DC after the heart attack, that would not have been a good idea to continue in that role? That role had some stress and high pace and things like that associated with it.
The role and the general lifestyle of DC was very up tempo. It's very high paced. Even when we were there, we would tell people you could feel yourself kind of decompress once you left the city.
Really?
It's just it's very different, certainly than Tennessee, and certainly different than anywhere else we had lived. I imagine a lot of metro cities might be similar, but there's just kind of there's a kind of a tense style and sense of life there that I think anybody
almost
who's lived there is a franticness of living in DC. And unless you take really intentional time, I'm talking like schedule it regularly to get out of the city physically. I mean, if you could do it by doing, going to some parks and that kind of stuff in DC, where there's plenty of things to do for recreation and leisure. It's not completely a concrete jungle, but I think unless you make time regularly to get out of the city and decompress, even if it's for a weekend or a day, then at least there was a situation where we were, which was just kind of stressed out, weren't really flourishing.
Okay. What is it about that makes that city that way? Because there's a couple other people have lived there that have said the exact same thing. Now, they weren't in a job like yours, though. Yeah. But is it just the high pace of political life in DC's? There's a lot of that going on there. Is that what it is, or what makes DC that way?
That's part of it. I think it's a big part of it, because especially if you're in that environment, it's certainly a big part of it, particularly in this era. So I was there from 2010 to 2018, so about 8 years, or about 8 years, and so I was there for about, I guess, 6 years of Obama administration and 2 years of the Trump administration. And there was a marked difference after 2016, so beginning in 2017, the pace of Capitol Hill and the federal government in particular. There used to be kind of natural breaks in the congressional calendar. I think I tallied it up one time. I think there's something like the Congress is out of session for about 12 weeks out of the year. Doesn't mean they're not working. It just means they're probably back home in the districts and that kind of thing. But then, like, they're like 12 weeks worth of days that Congress is out of session. Okay. So theoretically, activity is supposed to be more chill, right? So everybody has heard of the August recess, which is typically 1 to 2 weeks, maybe more, or the whole month up sometimes, where members of Congress are back in their districts. Nobody's on Capitol Hill. The interns are wearing flip-flops and khakis. Like, it's kind of a disgrace. But that was kind of a normal ebb and flow for the holidays. So there are kind of these built-in breaks to the lifestyle there. 2017, that went away pretty quickly. So it's kind of like all on all the time, because even if Congress is out of session, the political news cycle is always turning. So nothing really stops. So you still have to always be paying attention. So that changed. And so that contributes to it. But a big part of it is just the DC commuter life. I managed to, wherever we lived, I managed to have, less than an hour commute one way. But even for me, that's, you have to count on 2 hours of your day is commuting. Right. A lot of people, it's a lot more.
Really?
And a lot of that's done on, a lot of it's people driving, a lot of it's public transportation. Transportation is somewhat inconsistent around there. I think it's gotten better. So there's a pace of getting into the city and then getting out of the city. So set aside the job, the life of getting to and from work and life is pretty dramatic, and nobody really, I forget the numbers, but the population of Washington D.C. swells so much during the day and then drops in the evening. So when you see like public transportation, things like metro and buses, lines, that kind of things shut down, say for like a weather. It's not so much that they're concerned about the now, like the inbound morning, because you're like, oh, it's birds are chirping and it's fine and nothing's going on. But if a weather event hits midday, then you're stuck with a bunch of people inside the city. You can't get home. And so that's just to kind of try to paint the picture of how broad that is.
Yeah.
And then you have high-rise lifestyle, where because of that commute, you have to really be proactive to make friends with even your neighbors, because everybody gets home and they're exhausted.
I see. Sure.
And so there's just kind of multiple factors that feed into a pace of life in DC. And then if you don't make great money, there's the financial stress on top of that. And so you're looking at a city where a median income for a family of 3 is like over $100,000. And that's not saving. That's not putting away from.
You need every penny of that.
That's covering your costs.
I see.
And so unless you have one or both spouses making some dough, over time that gets really, really difficult.
I can imagine.
And then younger couples like we were, you can live in little bitty boxes of 700 square feet or 100 square feet, but you start having kids, that starts to amplify. And people tend to move out to the suburbs.
I see.
And we were considering that, but one of the factors was, I would consider working in this space, same job or different job. We would have to move out to the suburbs. But even if it's like 20 minutes down the road, you're in a situation where the commute and the traffic is such that you would have to recreate your entire social network.
I see.
Basically. So even if you went to church, if I live in Lebanon, you say Mount Juliet?
Creve Hall now, just south of Nashville. Yeah.
So Franklin, going 20 minutes, going from one side of town to another here in Nashville, I know it's getting worse, but it's not that big a deal.
It's not that big a deal, man.
Right. But from going from one neighborhood to another in DC, like you basically have to give yourself an hour.
Yeah.
To go anywhere. And so, when your evening commute is an hour. Right. So you'd be looking at already, assuming let's say I left the office early at like 5, get home, if everything's running on time, 6, then family time, right? If to do anything in the evening, you're at best getting started at 6:30 or 7. And so it's just the pace of life, the geographics play a factor, the traffic plays a factor. And so we were one of the factors was if we're going to uproot my family and try to, reestablish our entire social thing, why wouldn't it be Tennessee? Right?
I see. Yeah, that makes total sense. There's something about, though, that fast pace that is attractive to me. Being in that city, always on, things moving very quickly, staying in the loop, staying in the flow. There's something about that seems sort of fun, maybe at least for some period of time.
No doubt, no question. We had a blast, and I loved my job. I loved it doing what I did.
Did you thrive on that fast pace?
I did for a while.
Okay.
And we loved the DC life. We loved the urban lifestyle thing for a season. Started to wear on us now. We miss our restaurants.
Up there?
Up in DC. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
People ask us, do you miss DC? And actually, once we left, not really.
Okay.
We miss a lot of our friends and restaurants. Those were our
interesting.
Those were our things. I will admit, though, for that reason, the excitement, the fun, my wife will tell you that once we made the decision to leave DC, I did my moping early before we left. Basically.
Okay.
So once we got here to Tennessee, I haven't looked back.
Okay.
But there were a couple months there where I was pretty mopey because I was having to cognitively, emotionally kind of detach from the city.
Yeah.
And frankly, I kind of got that. It was a Christmas or two before we made that decision, and we had come back to Tennessee for 2 weeks, and my wife was down here for 3 weeks because she was on an academic calendar, and I came down for 2 weeks. And we were here just long enough to you start to look at a place differently than vacation or visiting family. You're like, okay, what would we like to live here? For us, it would be live here again. What would it be like to move back? And we were just here just long enough. And then on the one hand, I thought, oh, that would be pretty cool. And then I started listing in my head, oh, I'd miss this. I'd miss that. I'd miss this access, this restaurant, this fun on Capitol Hill, right? And I realized that I was attached to that city in a way that was far more unhealthy than I thought it was. So I had come to that realization even before making precise job and life decisions. I had felt that like attachment that I hadn't really felt prior.
And it was an attachment to the city or your work or both?
Both.
Okay.
The whole lifestyle that goes along with working in DC.
Yeah, makes sense.
So because we're, the ERLC has an office on Capitol Hill. It's on the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It's the 3 blocks away from the Senate office buildings. It's, 4 or 5 blocks away from the Supreme Court, Capitol Hill Visitor Center. It's right there. It's a block away from Union Station. It's a high-paced job. A lot of cool things, a lot of cool perks. So like it was a thrill to work for Southern Baptist for 8 years up there. But you can get attached. And I was never really like politically enamored with stuff. But still the opportunities you have to work and influence people and make friends and all that, there's a real appeal to that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I just there was a Christmas that before we moved down here that I had felt I was like, oh, I'm more attached to this place.
I see.
In a way that I hadn't thought about
that
before.
maybe would not be healthy.
Yeah.
Okay. I do want to hear more about your role there with ERLC, but first I want to come back to before I forget what sounded like the faster pace of, did you say Congress after Trump?
Yeah.
Was that because of Trump? What made that happen?
I think part of it's Trump. I mean, I wouldn't put it all on him. I think he and the media have this symbiotic relationship that was true since day one, since he rode down that escalator, and so they kind of feed off each other, right? And so I understood real quickly that when everything the news cycle all of a sudden became dominated by the Twitter cycle, I was like, this is going to be exhausting. And with the Obama administration, whatever you say about the Obama administration or our political problems at the time, that pace of constant bickering back and forth at the political level just wasn't there. Part of it may have been Obama wasn't on Twitter like President Trump is. That was still an era in which presidential access to handheld devices was more secure and limited.
It's true, yeah.
It wasn't. I think they were. I mean, clearly the White House used Twitter. I'm sure Obama had an account, but it was far more. It wasn't as personality driven. I think. I'm happy to be corrected on somebody who. has more recall, but that was my sense of things. And so when you get yourself into an era where everything's about the Twitter cycle, and then it's like perpetual news reports about who said what on Twitter, and then who argued back on Twitter, and it's just constant. And then you have someone who, like a president, who feeds on that and contributes to it and fans the flames on that, and then you have a media who wants to, doesn't thinks if they ignore it that they're being silent in the face of injustice on every single tweet, right?
Sure.
So argument that silence communicates approval or something like that.
Yeah.
It's true in some cases, but as a parent, you also know sometimes you just have to ignore bad behavior.
Right.
That's the one thing the media has not tried to do is ignore.
Yeah.
Bad
well, why would they?
Behavior. Right.
Why would they? Ignoring it doesn't sell.
So, all to say, I just think a lot of it has less to do with kind of the partisan politics and the content of it.
Oh, okay.
And more the communication battle that's constantly brewing. I mean, I can talk politics all day long, but I think that was an element that was new, that really changed the game, because now everybody has to be on all the time, and you have to see what the president said and all that kind of stuff. And so, like, I stopped following that kind of stuff pretty early on.
Okay. Pretty early on after Trump's presidency?
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
By following that, you just mean you would follow different Twitter accounts, or you would try less to keep up with it all? Focus on what's important, let the noise just kind of be noise?
Yeah, you have to try to identify noise as noise.
Yeah.
And because at the end of the day, particularly as advocates, you have a job to do, which is to represent your constituency and advance the ball in some way. That might be on Capitol Hill, that might be with a federal agency, that might be with the White House. But at the end of the day, we're there to advance some kind of policy agenda. And the noise of the Twitterverse and the media and all that kind of stuff, that can take away from doing that particular job.
I totally believe that. Do you see then the news driving policy or actually legislation then? Or is it just news? It's a whole bunch of noise. The American populace gets all excited about a whole bunch of things, but it doesn't really drive government? Or are you actually seeing when all of this happens, everyone gets such in a frenzy, it actually starts to drive policy and drives government?
I don't think it's certainly not driving it in a productive way. I think the pros who want to get policy across the finish line and get stuff done, they know how to step into those noise channels and play it so that you get the right voices at the right times, rowing in the right direction. You can do that. The clearest example is I'm blanking on it's the criminal justice reform package. I think it was the First Step Act. I'm sorry, I used to have this stuff committed to memory, but I'm a little rusty. That was, bipartisan legislation. It's not as great as it could have been, but it got some reform packages done and across the desk of the president, whose constituency we presume, and by a lot of his reputation in that White House, wouldn't be so predisposed to reforming the criminal justice system. But a lot of people who were smart worked a lot of hours for a lot of months, building relationships quietly, behind the scenes, not getting sucked into the Twitter media battles. And if you do that right, then you can get some actual policy across the finish line. So I don't see it driving that way, but it can be used so that when you finally get some pressure building in the right direction and you have consensus on policy issues, part of it's building consensus behind the scenes first. So you get Republicans and Democrats, and the right Republicans and the right Democrats on some consensus issues, you can get some stuff done. But, the media cycle can blow stuff up too. The good example for that was the last attempt at an immigration compromise. And you had, certainly the 3 times the Republicans tried to reform the healthcare. You remember those days? It seems like forever ago.
Yeah, it does.
But there was a concerted effort. We were involved in trying to contribute what Southern Baptists thought on immigration issues, which we'd done for over a decade, since I was with Southern Baptist, dating back to at least 2006 or 2007. And that bill got the closest any of those, what used to be called comprehensive immigration reforms. This was not it, but it was like something for both sides. Got the highest number of Senate votes it had gotten. Something like it had gotten at least to maybe 58. Again, it needed 60. But then you had former Senate staffers who are in frankly, anti-immigrant think tanks in D.C. calling their former bosses, peeling them off of legislation, and even it was a chaotic day, but there were basically 3 different bills that were being considered, and you didn't know the night before exactly what was going to be in each one of them. But when they were released, we kind of, as policy nerds and wonks, were like, oh, these are all designed to fail. It's designed to play to their bases, say we tried, but you know that because this camp is so far right that it's not going to get enough Democrats to vote on it. So that's designed to fail. It has the appearance of participating and deliberating. The Democrats have one that's so far left that it's not going to bring enough Republicans to the table. And if you're not serious about that, then it's not worth doing. And then the one in the middle got really close. But there was then that's a situation where the news cycle and the Twitter cycle, everything kind of blows up and people start getting scared of it publicly, the senators and
start getting scared of that one in the middle.
They start getting scared of being on the record, frankly, particularly if it's approaching an election year. This is part of the problem with our state of governance right now, because you have the body who's supposed to be deliberating and deciding and making law, scared of making law. And so
because of
they want to get reelected.
Yeah, it's not great.
No, it's not great. And so everybody throws their hands up when you get Supreme Court rulings that people don't like, and you're governing from the bench. It's like, well, if the legislative body would do the legislation and do it precisely, even given that you want to get reelected, that would solve a lot of issues. But part of the reason you have such a powerful presidency and the reason you have such a powerful court is that Congress refuses to do its job. A lot of people in Congress view Congress not as a legislator, but as a platform. So that feeds into the communication, Twitter, news cycle thing.
Yeah, I see.
Right. So it's a way to running for Congress helps elevate your profile. Maybe you want to run for president. Maybe you want to be president of a university. Maybe you want to. It's a resume builder instead of a worthy job.
Wow.
In and of itself.
Wow. So kudos to our governmental system, though, the way it's all structured and set up, that we can have people with these types of motivations and still have a somewhat functioning government.
Right.
I mean, my goodness,
right.
If this thing wasn't set up properly, it'd be a mess. It'd be over, right?
The balance of powers is a really brilliant thing and frankly underrated, and we don't talk about it a lot.
Yeah.
The voting and representative government, that's a big part of it. But the balance of powers is really the thing that sets everything apart.
Yeah, because man, it sounds like a lot of these motivations are just so far from trying to do what's right for the American people. It's just not.
It is.
Yeah, you need that balance of power.
Yeah.
You did mention the Trump's relationship with the news. What is that? Because he's always had that thing with the news, and he positions it like they hate him and he hates them. But is he using them? Like,
Sure.
is that just a positioning?
Yeah.
But really, what's going on is he's just playing them, or they're playing him. What is that relationship with Trump? And the news?
I think it's a, to use my word earlier, symbiotic. I think they both use each other, and I think he clearly uses it strategically, right? I mean, he was a reality TV star, right, before the presidency. That's how we know him, and so even before running for president, that was his persona. Whatever you think of his politics or anything like that, the fact is he's playing a different game than we've seen in American presidential politics. And I think that playing off the media is clearly a mode that we haven't seen a president use in a long time. So I think he clearly uses that, whether it's to his advantage or disadvantage all the time. He knows that that's a thing. And I think the media broadly speaking, and again, I say this knowing a lot of great reporters. My critique of Congress includes knowing a lot of great members of Congress who actually do want to get stuff done and actually do want to legislate and make better laws and compromise in the positive sense of the term. But I think, the media, here's a good example. When the media kind of took on the anti-Trump position early, even before he was elected, If you go way back to 2017,
Yeah.
there was a moment. Well, a good example was when the media flipped their lids over the appointment of Justice Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. It was #resistance that early. There had been a vacancy that Mitch McConnell had kept open during the Obama administration. Everybody was aggravated about that Obama didn't get to make that appointment. And so you saw just the resistance stuff go full on, turn it up to 11 for Gorsuch, who by all accounts is a sane, credible judge.
Mm-hmm.
Fast forward a few months, and President Trump fires FBI Director Comey. That, regardless of your politics, should be concerning when the President of the United States fires an FBI director,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's associated with an investigation into his own administration.
Right.
That should set people's hair on fire.
Yeah.
But the media and the #resistance had already turned the volume up to 11 on something that was entirely credible, like Gorsuch. And so by the time people they're flaming Trump for Comey, it's all people don't hear it because it's been noise the whole time.
Yes.
And so why would you expect even hesitant Trump supporters, why would you expect people to give the Comey coverage the seriousness it deserved when you went ballistic over Gorsuch?
Yeah. And you're kind of burnt out at this point, or you're too focused on that.
Yeah. And so what you have is a situation, and there are others who have studied this and kind of quantified this more so than me, is what you have is kind of the bulk of our electorate, or a significant portion of our electorate is the moderates. We're just exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
We're exhausted from the noise. We're exhausted from the news cycle, whether it's Twitter or 24/7 cable news. We're just exhausted, and so we're not going to be convinced necessarily by watching anybody's rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
We just disengage, and so the people that continue to be engaged are the people who are most appeased and interested by the noise, right?
Yes.
And so that contributes long term, especially to this polarization. So because a vacuum will be filled, and so you have otherwise good, credible, moderate people, even left and right, people who disagree passionately, even on certain issues. We're not talking about like squishy people who don't care.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about people who would otherwise be engaged were it not for this insane communication patterns that we have. And so we're more likely to, disengage. We've got families to raise. We've got, gymnastics to go to, or baseball to go to, whatever, family things to do. We're going to continue doing those and doing our jobs, but we're going to disengage from what's supposed to be a self-governing thing, a participatory governance.
Yeah.
And so long term, you have, people just turn the volume down.
Mm-hmm.
We might, post stuff to Facebook. We might make snarky remarks, that kind of stuff. But by and large, we're kind of tired of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's not helpful.
No, it's not. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's not going to end well, right? I mean, that's not going to put us that does not put us on a path to success here, a path to healing. I mean, that's a scary thing when you're reasonable, moderate, wise, everyday people of America are disengaging, and then you have the fanatics on the right and the left that love it, that love that all of that fodder and noise and extremism and anger and yelling and all of this. I mean, I think it's happening right now with some of the race-related stuff. I think you have people that didn't know what to do, and so they're going to voice some of their thoughts, and then whatever those thoughts are, you realize you step in a little bit, and so now you're just sort of retracting, and well, okay, then I'll stay quiet on this matter. Right. The issue with that is, and look, I understand, like, we're not going to fix the world through social media. I mean, that goes without saying. However, there are a couple of people that I follow on social media, and I know them personally, but I'm not with them every day. I don't get the amount of time with them where I could get without social media, I wouldn't know their viewpoints on a whole lot of things.
Right, sure.
And knowing their viewpoints on a whole lot of things is very helpful to me. It's instructive to me. I don't retweet it all. I don't parrot it. I don't try to copycat it, but it's helpful because I know who they are. I respect them. I know their ideology, their theology, those types of things. And I appreciate when they voice some of their thoughts on current events, social justice type issues, for example, because that's what we're talking about. That helps form me as a young man. That helps me form. Well, if they stop doing that altogether, well, I, for one, and maybe some others, would experience a bit of a void there. Yeah. And then that void is going to be filled with just extremists. So this is not good that people are getting just kind of stepping back.
Right.
What's the path forward here? It's
a great question. I think for Christians in particular, there is space for us to, I think we need to, before we get into the Bible and politics, we need to step a few steps back. What do I mean by that? Drawing a straight line from the Bible to public policy it's very rare for you to be able to do that. There are some bright line issues, murder, for example, but application of that is complex. I've been engaged in it in varying capacities for almost 2 decades now. It's complex. Lots of stuff that Christians in particular, people of goodwill, could disagree on the particulars, while we ought to be agreeing on biblical principles that are pretty clear. Stepping back from politics, the one another passages of Scripture, obligations from one Christian to another, we don't get a opt out. There's no opt out verse from those for the sake of politics, right? So there's a whole battery of kind of ethical responsibilities we have one to another within the church about how to treat one another that we ought to carry with us when we engage politics, especially when we're debating those in the church. And so for some reason, I have a few theories, but for a lot of reasons, we don't do that. We engage politics in a very different way than we engage just about any other debate within the church, or political issues, or if an issue becomes political, then we change how we discuss them. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does make sense, yeah.
But for example, particularly when fellow church members are pasting and debating on Facebook, I'm one to discuss policy and politics, and I'm okay with that. But I also want to make sure I'm communicating that in a Christian manner, or communicating Christianly. It doesn't mean shying away from convictions, but it does require us to treat the other person with dignity, which means we don't get to somehow make some kind of snide remark that basically says you don't get to talk about this anymore, right? Or your viewpoint is invalidated, that I don't want to hear it. And we have all sorts of linguistic tricks that we do that, but sometimes the point is, for example, you might post an article, say about the race thing, and someone says, well, if my church ever did that, I'd stop contributing. Well, what is that? It's not an engagement. It's not a fruitful engagement of the subject matter. It's designed to intimidate. It might come off as a gruff old man or whatever, but it's designed to intimidate and shut down conversation. When church members are doing that to one another, that's a problem. Yeah. So a lot of our political discourse problems for a Christian perspective, I think is rooted in kind of a lack, we forget, we kind of silo off politics from the rest of our Christian obligations.
Yes, we do. We do. There's something about it that I think it's the part of it, maybe the emotionality of it, the polarization of it. You had retweeted something from Paul D. Miller, who I don't know who that is, but his Twitter handle's @Paul D. Miller 2.
He's fantastic. Follow him.
Yeah, I will. podcasts are the return of the conversation salon. At worst, they can be meandering, occasionally boring and insular, but at best, they are the last holdout of decent, insightful public dialogue. Turn off the TV, turn on the podcast, and save democracy.
That's right.
I was like, oh, that's so great, man.
Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing to him. You should have him on your podcast.
Oh,
he has a podcast that he hosts called Awkward Conversations.
Oh, yeah?
Which is pretty brilliant. He's a foreign policy expert. He currently teaches at Georgetown.
Okay.
Brilliant guy, brilliant Christian. He's contributed to some work from the ERLC.
Okay.
So he's a wonderful brother. And super talented in his space.
I love to look into him more, but I thought that was really good. And would you use social media? Mm-hmm. What do you use primarily?
It's primarily Twitter and Facebook.
Okay.
Instagram has become mostly my kiddo pictures.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it works better. It's better. It's easier to communicate ideas on policy, et cetera, on Twitter than Instagram for sure, it's built that way.
Sure.
But, do you view it as, here's a great place to have a conversation, here's a great place to share some thoughts, but you won't get into like a back and forth argument on Twitter, or do you? Mm-hmm. Or do you view it as, look, these are great places, these are great on-ramps into an article or to a podcast or something like that, and you would take care not to post anything that is too contentious on social media? Yeah,
I definitely try not to inflame people on social media. Part of that is from experience. I have the background of having, I used to, when they had comment sections on the ERLC website, I was, for a period of time, in charge of moderating that.
Oh boy.
And figuring out how we were going to do that. That's a rabbit trail that doesn't really deserve going down all that much, except for you learn some tips and tricks about online communication. Number one, I had formulated like 5 rules basically that we posted in the comment section about, like, this is what, this is our website and this is how we're going to moderate. You can love it or leave it basically. Mm-hmm. It was done in a winsome manner. But number one, when people are online anonymously, that's not a good faith actor. And so what I try to tell people who I like a lot on Twitter, who get all out of sorts and offended when an anonymous Twitter account says something nasty about them with under 100 followers, and they retweet it and like condemn it. I'm like, guys,
who cares?
Who cares?
Yeah.
You're punching down like several weight classes. You have 20,000 followers. You have 40,000 followers because you're a published author. You're fantastic. We love you. Who cares about what this twit on an anonymous account says about you? Mm-hmm. Just ignore it. Do not look at the mentions.
Yeah.
Just don't do it, especially at a certain level. I'm not at that level.
Yeah.
And then, so you require identity. And of course, Twitter and Facebook, you have the identity portion. But what my, former boss, Russell Moore, used to say was that social media has done what video games did to a lot of us. And it's basically turned our public discourse into a video game experience. So you get the experience of having done something. You think you've done something civically minded by tweeting or hashtagging something or whatever. The truth is, you probably didn't contribute much at all to meaningful public discourse. You certainly didn't forward the ball as far as getting policy actually accomplished. But you might have ticked off a lot of people. And in the Christian space, you might have served to provide a poor witness. And so for the social media thing, what I've learned, and I'm certainly not 100% perfect on this, but what I try to remember, and this goes true for talking heads, TV news stuff too, we can get really sucked into winning the debate with the person we're debating, and we kind of want to club them to death to win our argument. What we often forget are the most important audience for any kind of debate is the audience, people who are watching you, people who might not even be liking, or, subtly liking, picking sides based on the likes of a debate on Twitter. People are watching your discourse. They're watching it, whatever your position is, whoever you are, but particularly if you're a Christian engaging the public space about Christian things or trying to bring a Christian You've kind of opted in and being like, hey, I'm a Christian. I'm going to discuss public things.
Yeah.
People are watching that.
Mm-hmm.
And that, particularly over time, really, people are paying attention to that more than you think. And so you can see, and I've seen it done by Christians on Twitter. I've seen it done with Christians on 24 channel prominent national news media, where they get so sucked into like arguing their point and berating the guest, they're opposite them, or even feeling attacked by the guest, maybe rightly, that they lose the audience. And so, for example, like a conservative theologian debating a liberal theologian. If a conservative theologian lets the liberal guy get under their skin and gets all antsy and hot, well, people gravitate towards the liberal guy, even though on paper,
right,
if you wrote down their statements,
yes,
people would side with the theological conservative.
Yes.
But nobody wants to go have a coffee with that guy.
Yeah.
Same thing on Twitter. Same thing on Facebook, I think. And so I think when you're engaging and even debating, which I haven't done a lot of recently, I did have one back and forth again with a brother of Christ. We debated a very nuanced issue
on Twitter.
On Twitter.
Okay.
I try to stay away from that now. First of all, to really do it well takes a lot of time.
Oh yeah, you mean to debate?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
It takes a lot of time. And sometimes it's worth doing, sometimes it's not. But the way in which we do that, it ought to be charitable, and we ought to try not to talk down to one another.
Yeah.
Years ago, this was a Facebook thing, which I've definitely not done in years. I felt I was engaging a brother. I think it was on an immigration issue, or it was a Muslim immigration issue, something to do with that realm of things. I had a brother post who ought to know brother, who's a theological conservative Christian, I believe him to be, and he completely misappropriated a passage of scripture. And I called him out on it, and it took some days, mind you, to work him off of that commitment to where he recognized his error, and you're like, yeah, you're right. He still didn't agree with me on the content of the issue.
Sure.
But the point was he recognized that scripture he deployed it completely out of place.
Gotcha.
But what I had to do, I had another brother of Christ in my other church who I could see from kind of preliminary responses on that thread just wanted to pound the living daylights out of this guy with the social justice rhetoric. So I had to back channel this guy and say, look, I think this guy's movable based on what I know about his commitments to scripture that he and I both share. So I had to kind of fend off my progressive brother for the sake of trying to move my conservative brother.
Yeah.
Based on principles that we all share.
Right.
But in the social media space, people were about to, throw fists.
Yes.
So, and but to do that took days of Facebook thread posts.
Right.
It was exhausting.
Yes. Yeah, it really is.
Don't do it.
Yeah, don't do I totally agree. Yeah, and the Twitter thing, it's man, you start trying to respond to people, and a lot of times there's not 100 character answer that does it any justice, or 280 characters. I mean, I don't know how many words you can spit out in sitting down with someone for 5 minutes and having a conversation, but you can get a lot out there. Yeah. It's a whole lot more than 280 characters. Yeah. Yeah. And when you're trying to convey a point in response and back and forth, man, it does take so much time.
Yeah. Especially to do it well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. What about what does it say of our day and age where we have Twitter, a privately owned? Twitter is not publicly traded, correct? I think it's private.
I forget.
Well, no, I'm not sure, but it's
Either way.
Yeah, it's privately owned or it's public, whatever. But it's a business within the United States of America that is censoring our president's communication. Yeah. Now, I think I'm following Donald Trump. I don't know, but I never really go through the people on Twitter. It would take way too much time. But
don't use the timeline. Use lists.
That's right. Yeah, I'd never use the timeline. Yeah, use lists for sure. But I did go over to Trump's tweets, I don't know, 2 weeks ago or so, when the first one got censored, and 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was a pretty good dumpster fire he had going over there. I'll say that much. I mean, it looked pretty crazy.
Yeah.
However, we do now have these companies that are censoring the president of the United States' communication.
Yeah.
What should we be thinking about that?
Very complicated. I think Christians engaging this ought to be aware of the complexities. And it's clearly something that Christians of goodwill could debate on in good faith, like we were talking about before. There are others who are more up to speed on the details of this, especially on Twitter. Folks at National Religious Broadcasters have done some really good work in the past on kind of talking about things of free speech with the social media giants and all that kind of stuff. And it's incredibly complex. I think when it's a private company, you don't have First Amendment issues because the First Amendment has to do with government. When we say the president's communication, the president can communicate any which way he wants. He could do it by phone call, through letters, through executive orders, through news media, through whatever. So I'm cautious about using his Twitter feed as the president's communication.
I get that. Yeah.
Any more than it's my communication.
Sure.
I do think there's a case. I mean, we have a situation where you have a long history now governing of things that are governments, things that are industries, private companies, and then you have utilities, which is kind of a mix. There's a lot of law history that goes into why we do things the way we do. I'm willing, one thing, I think it's ridiculous for the government to manage social media. It's out of its depth. And it's out of the movement of government rightly is slower than what it is in the private industry, and certainly within technological space. Lots of evidence of that. I think people are right to be a little unnerved about global companies who have been so successful in creating these platforms. I'm willing to see, again, creative legislators have to deliberate and weigh these things out and weigh the pros and cons and try to be credible about things. I'm willing to, theorize at least a kind of a fourth category, like the one that's not kind of currently on the books because of how dominant social media is. At the same time, we have to recognize Twitter's not the real world, politically or otherwise. All sorts of surveys can diagnose that. So if you live on Twitter and if you think that's real life, there's plenty of data to show that's not the case. Twitter users are a subsection of subsections of the American populace, and certainly of the global populace. So to presume that Twitter is the end all be all, and that's we need it, or even that the president of the United States needs it, I think is to make a fundamental category mistake of how we think through things. Certainly, it sets a dangerous precedent. But again, I think that's just Twitter censoring the president. It's just another iteration of this symbiotic relationship between the president and media companies that we've seen since the beginning. It's just the latest skirmish in a greater war. That's how I'm thinking about it. That may be too vague. But I'm not losing sleep over it.
Okay. Yep. No, that makes total sense. Just because I don't know and I'm curious, you mentioned that one point there was 3 bills being presented that day, right?
Yeah, on the immigration thing.
Yep, on the immigration thing. What would have been like a catalyst for those bills to be presented? Someone just had a good idea one day and said, hey, what if we kind of present this bit of legislation? Or is there sort of like a set deadline or a cadence with some of these things?
Yeah. The answer is it all depends. Sometimes it's a news cycle thing. Sometimes it's there's a existing law that is expiring. It needs to be renewed, and so that kind of forces legislatures' hands to do something. At the very least, they have to all vote to renew it with no changes, but that's still an action. We ran into this frequently with there's a government organization called the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we call it USERF for short. That typically only gets a 2 or 3 year renewal. Basically, it's set to expire, and so every time within 3 or 4 months of that deadline, there's always a senator that tries to weigh in and use the expiration as the leverage point, because nobody really wants to get it shut down, but one senator can hold it hostage basically and say, they're going to have to close down those offices unless you agree to my thing.
Right.
And so it's a negotiation point. Other times it's just kind of a news cycle thing. I forget what it was at the time, but the immigration stuff was pretty hot at the time. DACA was hot, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, which provides, since the Obama administration basically provides if an illegal someone's here illegally in the U.S. but was brought here as a child, we don't want to hold them legally culpable for their status, and so we want to give them some kind of legal status. The content of which I agree with. It's not great that Obama did it through executive order. Trump tried to undo it through executive order. Supreme Court weighed in and said, you did it incorrectly. You undid it incorrectly, President Trump. All of which could have been averted had Congress, again, actually done its job, either under Trump administration or under Obama administration or under Bush administration. 3 presidential administrations now have not dealt with this, at least. So there may have been just a news cycle that was hot about it, putting pressure on it. In that case, it may have been, again, my memory's foggy, but it was probably in an era where President Trump was pushing for wall funding for the Mexico border wall. And so there's a contingency that wants to do something for that particular issue, but to get legislation done to do that, you have to bring Democrats along too. You have to bring the other party along to get something actually that will pass Congress and get to the president's desk. And so if you have basically vested interests, recognizing that they have to get a compromise, have to bring enough people along to get what they want.
Yeah.
So there are a number of different factors that kind of bring stuff to a boil.
Yes, that makes sense. So, but you did mention the news cycle. So does it happen sometimes where something hits the news and it becomes a big issue in America to such extent that Congress then moves to enact a law based on everyone talking about this particular issue, whatever it may be? That does happen, can happen?
That does happen, can happen. I would argue from experience that it rarely manifests itself in something that actually resolves the problem. What often happens more than not is that members of Congress will introduce a bill that is either never going to see the light of day or isn't going to actually pass either one chamber or both chambers. So a lot of what can look like a member of Congress doing their job is they can say, "Hey, I introduced this legislation."
Based on the news, maybe?
Based on the news.
Say, okay.
Yeah. A good example of that was back in, if you remember, 2015, shortly after the Paris terror attacks. This is going back a little ways, but it's seared in my memory. After the Paris attacks in 2015, kind of anti-immigrant sentiment spiked.
Yeah.
It was particularly it was in the fall. And members of Congress, then a GOP-run House, introduced, I think it was called the SAFE Act, basically, which did a number of different things. But the short of it was going to more or less bring our even the refugee program to a screeching halt. It didn't say we're canceling the refugee program, but in practice, that's what it does. I would argue on content, it was an extreme overreaction. It's more or less what President Trump has tried to do in recent months and years through executive order and the authority of the administration. But the House got together, introduced the SAFE Act, which was terrible law, but they passed it. House chamber. Never stood a chance of passing the Senate. Didn't matter. They could go back to their districts and say, "Hey, we want to make you more secure. This is what we did. We've passed this bill." It'll never become law. Didn't stand a chance. It's not designed to actually get across to the president's desk, but it looks good for your constituency.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. What was your role at ERLC? You were with them with 8 years?
Well, I was
Or
in
longer?
DC for them with 8 years, but I was with them in total for 17 years. So
wow.
Yeah.
How did that all come about?
I'm a Southern Baptist unicorn.
And before the 8 years in DC, were you here in Nashville?
I was here in Nashville.
Okay.
Yeah, that's how I got connected with the ERLC to begin with. And so I wore a lot of different hats with the ERLC. Starting in 2001, I was hired to run a recording studio. For
Straight out of school at this point?
Straight out of school, yeah.
Okay.
I'd gone to Belmont to do, of all things, music business.
Really?
I thought I was going to be a recording engineer and
No way.
producer at that era of my life. So I literally have a music business degree from Belmont University.
Wow.
But close to graduation and shortly after graduation, a friend of mine was producing talk radio for this guy named Richard Land for this organization called the ERLC, neither of which I'd ever heard of. I didn't grow up Southern Baptist.
Oh, you didn't?
I did not.
Would you grow up in church?
I did grow up in church. I'm kind of an ecumenical mutt.
Okay.
So I've been with Southern Baptist for 2 decades now, but my parents grew up Methodist. I was sprinkled in a Presbyterian church when I was a baby. Grew up in a mainline, not a mainline denomination necessarily. It's a denomination called the Christian Missionary Alliance.
Okay.
Which is kind of a Presbyterian Baptist hybrid.
Yeah, interesting.
I hope they don't take offense of that. I say it affectionately. My dad is a CMA pastor.
Okay.
So that's where I came to faith in Christ and really grew up in the faith. Richard Land and the ERLC decided that was Baptist compatible.
Okay.
when I was in my interview process.
Yeah.
And frankly, there's not a whole lot of difference.
Sure.
They believe in adult believers baptism and they want to send missionaries all over the globe, and so there's a lot of harmony. I was attending a Southern Baptist church in Nashville at the time, so there really wasn't all that much difference, except for some minor things that we kind of had to work out. But all to say, it was a new space to me, and even at the time, I thought, 2-3 years, I'll work in this radio studio and I'll go back to I'll go back to music.
Yeah.
Never happened. Some opportunities and interests and aptitudes kind of changed, and I got away from the technical side of things and got into producing the content, and then executive producer over 2 radio programs. And then a lot of that content had to do with religion and politics, church in the public square. And we had a sister office in Washington, D.C., and I had worked with enough with those folks to be like, oh, I'd be interested in doing that. And so in 2010, they were kind enough to ship me up to Washington for a pretty dramatic career shift. Let me get my feet wet in the policy office. Did a master's degree alongside that in D.C. And from there, kind of worked my way into what was ultimately for about 3 years. I started off doing kind of research assistant jobs, helping staff craft, policy stuff and doing research background stuff on policy, and started going to Capitol Hill meetings, coalition meetings, really, because my boss at the time, Barrett Duke, the vice president there at the time, you can only be one place at a time.
Right.
Right. And so he needed someone at the time to kind of go be eyes and ears, and just kind of listen in and bring what at that point was a 10-year stint with Southern Baptist, and just think Southern Baptistly of the conversations I listen in on.
Part of my ignorance here, but when you say Capitol Hill meeting, what is that? Who's there?
Sure. It's a very generic term for any sort of meeting we could have. Mostly we describe them as coalition meetings. And so you have a group of like-minded people who are like-minded on narrow, particular public policy goals, will collaborate and work together to influence policy in Washington.
Okay.
That might be legislation in Congress. That might be a federal agency that's issuing new rules. That in some cases, many cases, has to do with strategizing around Supreme Court cases and arguments. So even though even organizations who are not attorneys, they weigh in through what's called friend of a court briefs or an amicus brief that basically kind of weighs in with opinions on how a court ought to decide. Both sides of a conflict, of a judicial conflict, will weigh in. And there's a whole orbit of strategy and theory about how to best influence the court in that respect. So a lot of times sometimes those are meetings with government officials. Sometimes those are meetings with just what we call civil society. So basically, short term is NGOs, so a non-governmental organization.
Gotcha.
So other nonprofits, other lobby groups, that kind of stuff.
Meeting with NGOs to maybe prepare for a meeting with a congressman or woman or
exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So as kind of off-hill advocate groups, we can't just, even as big as Southern Baptists are, we can't walk onto Capitol Hill and say, hey, introduce this legislation, pass this legislation. There's not one group who can do that.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe alcohol, labor, auto industry, healthcare. But even then, you're not one organization, right?
Sure.
It's an orbit of players.
I see.
And so it always takes a coalition.
I see.
Sometimes those coalitions take the form of like brick and mortar coalitions where like there's an umbrella organization that knowingly, very publicly represents, like a professional industry, like a labor group or, or what you might traditionally think about as a lobby group, people who represent the milk industry, for example, or the farm industry. Most of the time, though, they're kind of ad hoc coalitions. There are people who are only involved in collaborating together for the sake of a narrowly focused policy agenda. Sometimes you collaborate with groups that you wouldn't ordinarily share a lick of similarity with.
I see.
And international religious freedom is a good example of that, because even though Southern Baptists don't agree with Muslims or Hindus or atheists on theology, we agree that it's really terrible when people are getting their heads lopped off for the sake of their beliefs. That tends to bring people together. And so you can collaborate on really narrowly focused issues that, say, in this case, helped guide how the U.S. government engages international actors, states and non-state actors, in the context of their foreign policy, so that the foreign policy administration, part of the administration, takes religious freedom seriously as one factor among many, as they do their diplomatic job. So, so that's what coalitions meetings, or meetings, they could be a lot of one-on-one things, but usually, 2 or 3 people who are kind of core organizations say, hey, we'd like to see this get done. How do we do that? Who else do we need to bring on board? And then so you embark on a months-long process of doing that. Sometimes it's in response to something sometimes terrible that administration has done. And so you collaborate just to send publish a public letter that says we're outraged about this and you ought to change it. But strategizing how to do that and how to word that so you get a lot of people on board to express their frustration, because you can write advocacy letters in such a way that it's too narrow that only you and your people agree with it, right? So like we could, for example, again on religious freedom stuff, we could write, advance religious freedom in a letter that lays out a Christian understanding of religious freedom. And we might do that, and we have. But if you want non-Christian collaborators to join with you on that, you have to write that letter differently.
Right.
And so it kind of all depends on what your strategy is. A lot of times you write letters for our sake just as Southern Baptists. Catholics write their stuff just as Catholics. Other times we'd collaborate. And so we and the Catholic office would collaborate to do some of the same things. But the text of that letter looks a lot different than the text of our individual letters.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So there's kind of a linguistic skill set involved there that you can kind of learn over time, but it's teachable. But to your point, to your question, that's kind of what a Capitol Hill
makes sense. So you started attending some of those meetings?
I started attending those, and what I couldn't have really anticipated on the front end, and that we kind of all recognize on the front end, is once I'd been around Southern Baptist for a decade or more, you kind of have a sixth sense about, you kind of can think about, okay, how does our constituency think about issue X, Y, or Z. And so that's really valuable when either other NGOs or Capitol Hill people are asking your office, to support, oppose, engage something that they want to advance.
Mm-hmm.
And depending upon the issue, we could be like, yeah, we're on board for that. Other issues are like, our constituency is kind of split on this. We see biblical principles at play, but the particulars, you're going to find disagreement within the pews. Which frankly, we're Baptists, so there's always disagreement in the pews.
Sure.
But where there's consensus, and we can talk about consensus, but where there's clear consensus and we believe clear doctrinal perspectives, we could weigh in pretty heavily. Otherwise, or we could say, Southern Baptists are still kind of debating this among themselves, and we can't. There's no reason we're not really in a position to weigh in on this at this time.
Mm-hmm.
We might have educational responsibilities then at that office to help Southern Baptists and maybe the greater evangelical community educate themselves on what this particular issue looks like your question about Twitter and the president, right? So there's kind of an educational thing. All to say, we kind of figured out that I would not overcommit Southern Baptists at all, and I would be not presume things. And if I didn't know the answer to the question, I knew where to get the answer to the question, which also brings credibility. When you can say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that question, but let me go back to headquarters and ask around. And so by the time Russell Moore came on board, they basically expanded that role for me. And so I was coalitions director for 3 years. So I was basically guided the work of the Washington, D.C. office in its collaboration with other people, mostly other NGOs. And so most of the time was spent relationship building and providing a new touch point with organizations who didn't necessarily have a face to put with the office necessarily. So there's a lot of networking and relationship building in that context. And then we would collaborate together on particular issues. And at which point either I would be the one collaborating, or I'd kind of hand off relationships to other people in the office who had better relationships on Capitol Hill. So it's a very relationship-oriented business. And then the last 2 years, when Travis Woussos took over as vice president of that office, he wanted an extra hand. Basically, I had my colleague Stephen Harris at the time. He was more our Capitol Hill liaison, and Travis wanted a little extra firepower on Capitol Hill. So it was. Jobs are very similar, but I was basically a policy director, which just meant more government interaction and a little less networking, kind of seeking out NGO relationships, which by that point I'd had 3 years of doing, and a much lengthier taking other colleagues in the history of that office and in total, you have a wealth of relationships at that point to draw on.
Yeah, I'm sure. So ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the public policy, it's the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And there's an office in Nashville, there's an office in D.C.
Yes.
Russell Moore is now president of ERLC.
That's correct.
And he's in the Nashville office. Yes. Is the Nashville office headquarters or not?
They don't really like to talk about it as headquarters. They like to talk about it as its two equal offices. Okay. There just happens to be there's a larger volume of staff in Nashville.
There is. That's I was going to ask.
Larger volume of staff, and then Nashville, the DC office is because of its location and its design. It's predominantly government relations.
Sure. How many people work out of the Nashville office and how many out of the DC office?
Probably 3/4 in the Nashville office.
Okay. And how big? How many employees roughly? Give or take?
I don't know now. It's 20 or so, give or take, depending upon the season.
Okay.
And they tap
total.
Total, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 20 to 25 people.
Oh, okay. So out of the DC office, you might have had 10 or 15 people?
No, less than that, 5.
Oh, wow. Okay.
5 to 6 maybe at a peak. So.
Interesting. But you still had a specific office that people were coming into. It was very, very much in the middle of all the action there.
Yeah, they own what they call own a row house on Capitol Hill.
Oh, okay.
And that the ERLC bought in the 90s, early to mid 90s.
Yeah.
That they own outright now.
Yeah.
So it's a heck of a resource. It's a beautiful building. If you're in DC and a Southern Baptist, you should go visit them.
Oh, yeah?
They love giving tours. I did a lot of tours and loved visiting with Southern Baptist pastors and student groups that would come through.
Oh, that does sound pretty fascinating. And what year did you leave the
2018.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Wow. You miss it? You glad to be doing what you're doing now?
There's a lot I do miss. Thank you very much. There's a lot I do miss. And the people are fantastic at the ERLC.
Yeah.
But I'm loving what I'm doing now, which is maybe to get a question or two ahead of you. I'm working on a PhD.
I saw that
in public theology.
Yeah,
and it's hard to. It doesn't make any sense doing a PhD in my 40s unless you understand that what I'm trying to do basically is take a lot of my practical experience and give that some interaction with the scholarly realm. And so I'm really building on my experience at the ERLC to make a pivot to the academic and scholarly realm. And so in that respect, I love what I'm doing because I'm doing something different. The lifestyle and pace of life and the responsibilities are very different, obviously. But yeah, of course I was with the ERLC for 17 years. There are lots of parts that I'll miss.
I was going to ask about your PhD, public theology. Yeah. I don't even know if I've heard of that.
That's fair.
What is that?
Right. Well, the joke is that people would say, well, including an ethics professor in my seminary, is any theology private?
Yeah. That's a good point.
And the answer is the reason we call it public theology at all is because there's a history in Christendom where people actually were trying to make that case, that to say faith ought to be private. It's a private thing. The term is the privatization of religion. And people much wiser and much more learned than I have written volumes of this, but particularly around late 19th century, early 20th century, there's this rise of, religion's a private thing. Part of that was the rise of kind of scientism and secularization. And so you could do your religious thing over here, but just don't bring it into the public square. And so what public theology, more or less there's a kind of some cohorts from middle, late 20th century onward who are trying to kind of build, reform, probably all are applicable at some point. This thing called public theology, which, depending upon how you define it, could be basically the intersection of the church and the broader culture. In my particular instance, I'm really interested in local church and politics in particular. So I'm kind of a narrow focus on that. But the public theology is really kind of what I describe as the public witness of the church. And so what does it look like? How does the church interact with the outside world? There are a lot of different avenues, a lot of different angles you can take from that. But some of that it's kind of pointedly making a commentary in two words about a trend line, particularly in liberal theology that tends to diminish how outward our faith ought to be.
Yeah, fascinating. What would be a good outcome from this PhD, or a likely outcome? Do you have a kind of an eye towards a particular role? Or
I would love to help local churches reform their political witness. There's a lot packed in there. But if I make any kind of contribution, it's to build on a lot of great public theologians who I've learned a ton from and are studying with. I think we've missed something in how we talk about church and politics. There are a lot of reasons for this, depending upon how deep you want to go. But the short of it is, I don't think we have not developed from Scripture a playbook for how the local church in particular ought to engage the public square. And so we've allowed our political witness, and when I say political witness, we've allowed our decisions about how we think church ought to engage the public square and the politics in particular. I think whatever reasons we decide are relevant for how we believe it ought to exist, all of those reasons come from outside the church. They come from outside Scripture. For example, my top 3 list, if I can remember them, how we think about tax policy. The IRS regulations. Some people refer to it in shorthand as the Johnson Amendment. So it limits what pastors and churches can do in an electoral political cycle. We've taken that as kind of a chilling effect and actually most often limit what we can do, even though the actual legal limitations are very minor and very narrow. We've allowed that for all sorts of reasons to diminish the voice that pastors and churches have on social issues or political issues. Another one is Western individualism. We as Americans, we've grown up in this individualistic culture so much so that we don't engage the political sphere thinking about ourselves as part of an ecclesiastic body.
Yeah, you're right about that.
And I think that's really, there's a lot to mine there that could contribute to a better political witness. And so part of the reason we're so divided over politics is because it's such an individualistic thing for us. And so the church doesn't touch politics. We kind of put it in a silo on the back of campus,
yeah,
right? And only tap into it when we're forced to do so,
yeah,
either by an event or a news cycle or something, or so one particular issue drags a pastor, into the public arena, and by that time we haven't exercised any muscles,
right?
And so our engagement then is fraught with either error or hurt, and because we haven't been exercising, we don't know a playbook.
Yeah,
we know a lot
makes
of
sense.
rules,
Yep.
which you need when you go out in the playbook, or when you go out to play. Forgive the sports analogy, but football, for example, you have to know the rules, right? You have to know what's out of bounds. You have to know what direction you can run with the ball. You know who's you're able to throw the ball to. Those are all rules. But if your coach only did conditioning and only did rule book memorization and then sent 11 players onto the field, you would lose the game because you don't have a playbook. And we've allowed our playbook, politically speaking, to be defined by everything other than the church and other than Scripture. Instead of doing what we typically do for everything else, which is, what does Scripture have to say? Let's work out from there what our fill in the blank witness ought to be.
Yeah.
What ought to be our approach to widows and orphans? Well, let's start here. What ought to be our approach to hunger? Well, let's start here. Addiction, right? All these, you can see this, all these ministries exist in your church. What I might call, people call it mission, rightly. You could call it civic engagement because those, widow and orphan care, hunger, addiction, all those three churches do. Maybe your church does, my church does, some engagement in their community. You don't have to be a church member to be ministered by our church on those kinds of issues. You're engaging your neighborhood, you're engaging your community. We don't treat politics like that. Politics is like its own separate thing over here that we're either scared of or we're too enamored with. And so I think there's a reform to be done. I'm blanking on my third top three factor. But I'll just say, and maybe listeners can think of their own, example of like what has shaped your church's political witness.
Yeah.
The short of it, we typically have two models. We have the partisan church, which engages politics freely, but in a partisan manner. It doesn't mind being associated with one particular political party. It happens on both sides of the aisle, by the way, not just right or left. And then we have the silent church, who rightly rejects the partisan church, but I don't think is all that much. It's sub-biblical in a different way, because the silent church then has an entire. Well, let me say the good thing about the silent church, and the good thing about the partisan church. They have a sense of righteousness and justice that's very clear to them, and they want to advance in their culture. That's the positive. The silent church is going to be more representative of their community, theoretically, politically. So you might have more Democrats and Republicans worshiping together on a Sunday morning, but they just don't talk about politics.
Sure.
Right. The problem with that is you still have a congregation whose political consciences are formed by everything other than the church. Social media, 24/7 news media. You go down the list, family allegiances, workplace chatter. They're still being formed by Western individualism and all these other partisan influences. For the church to be silent on that, on many issues, doesn't mean every issue the church can speak on, but we ought to be cultivating political consciences of our church members in a way that recognizes that they have a responsibility in what we call the liberal democracy.
Yeah.
We are.
Now, how could a local church get involved there? I assume you're not talking about sort of incorporating the political issue of the day across the pulpit every Sunday morning.
Definitely not.
And what would you say to the people that, or to the pastor maybe that would say, well, I hear what you're saying, but it's not that we want our church to be uninformed. We just want to inform them by preaching the scripture.
Sure.
Expository preaching. We're going to stick to the gospel, and that will inform their thoughts and actions.
Yeah. I certainly wouldn't. Number one, I'm not talking about dragging local churches into partisan politics. Number one, do not endorse candidates or political parties. Stop it. People are listening. Don't do that.
Quit it.
Stop it. Not because the government says not to. Political endorsements are a game of the political party. Political party has no responsibility to care for the institution of the local church. Political parties are tools for good or ill. It's what we're stuck with. But even if you're a fan of your favorite political party, it has no obligation to look out for the interest of your church or your soul. So let's be clear about that. It doesn't mean a church ought to be silent on political issues, which ultimately tend to be about our issues of self-governance, and love of neighbor. And so if we're going to be consistent about loving our neighbor, we ought to be engaging in the civic space, and we ought to be engaging in the self-governance thing. And I think for the church to be silent on issues where there are clear biblical principles, not necessarily an endorsement of policy, but clear biblical principles about how we ought to treat one another and treat our neighbor, I think we're doing a disservice, certainly to our community, and I don't think we're cultivating our church members. So to your question about a pastor in a local church, some of this is a synthesis project. I've seen some pastors and churches engage politically, have some tips and tricks to engage in the political consciences of their members in really winsome, wise, pastoral ways. My favorite example is one of a former church I was at in Washington, D.C. They had a time of corporate prayer every Sunday morning. In that corporate prayer, they do a lot of different things. Right? They pray for the local body. They pray for specific. Well, they were a church plant when we were part of them, so they could they could pray through the names of the entire church roster in a given amount of time. Right?
Yeah.
I think they still do that to some extent. Pray for specific families and names. They pray for clearly. They pray for healing of sick people, and they pray for the witness of their church in the local community. They pray for the growth of their church. They pray for the health of their marriages. They pray for their children, the salvation of their children. Everything that you would expect in a corporate prayer. But there are a few extra additional elements that I like that they always include. And it's not always the same week to week. But there was always the corporate prayer was always in our context. It's going to be different for every church. They at least had some, if not fully written out, they had bullet points that they wanted to cover, depending upon who was praying. They always prayed for other churches, other local churches, nearby churches. So it's not political, but it has a sense of humility and contributing to the greater body and taking away what is often the case with our American churches, which is competition with neighboring churches, especially here in the Bible Belt. And so I liked that. And they would pray for local churches and pastors by name who they knew, right? So it makes it not about them. They would make it a practice of praying for government leaders of all different levels, both political parties. Didn't matter, and it wasn't every Sunday. But you have an opportunity there. Well, I'll come back to what the opportunity is. Other things they would include is they would pray for crises, either domestically or internationally. Whether it's humanitarian crises abroad, whether it's a school shooting domestically, they would pray for that. What's the opportunity there? Weekly, every Sunday, you're addressing not from the pulpit per se, in the context of the sermon, but you're able to use biblical language to talk about things that the people of Christ ought to be concerned with. You're talking about it in a nonpartisan way, and you're addressing God, so it's not about you. And you're, I think, over time cultivating the hearts of your people to listen to those kinds of issues with a biblical heart. that over time, I think, will bring dividends to a congregation.
Yeah.
If that helps. So
it does help. Yeah. So even something as simple as being deliberate about incorporating some of those things in your pastoral or corporate prayer in your service, that could be a great example of working towards this. Yeah.
And you're not picking a side.
Right.
But you're praying pastorally in most cases. It doesn't have to be a pastor giving the prayer, depending upon what your church believes on that kind of thing. But you're engaging your the corporate body, in helping them engage and frankly prick their hearts. But at least you're giving them biblical language how to speak about these things.
Sure, yeah, it makes total sense. So, do you, to the extent that you have been making plans or have been thinking about these things anyway, does this look like a local shop for you? Does this look like being a consultant? Does this look like plugging back into the ERLC?
Yeah.
What might be a path for you then?
If I were to design it myself, I'd love to have a foot in academia where I could teach some of these things, this and others, and then have a foot in the advocacy space.
Yeah,
I would love to help local churches walk alongside them and try to figure out what in their particular context would make sense, given their mission and conviction about what they think they ought to be in their local community, and then how first they ought to do some things to help cultivate what I, again, describe as the political conscience of their members internally. And then eventually, not right away, there are a lot of tips and tricks, a lot of best practices maybe that a church or any other religious nonprofit can do to be a voice in the public space that's not partisan, that protects the identity of the institution as an ecclesiastic body, but still gives voice to the people of God. That still expresses love for a neighbor. There are ways to do that, and there are a lot of ways to not do it. And I think, so part of this is the last thing I want to do. So part of it, I can deliver those tips and tricks like today. I can show you how to do that. My scholarly interest is how to root that in. I don't want to force this stuff back into Scripture in an inappropriate interpretation strategy, right?
Yep.
But I do want to look at mine Scripture for what are the top principles that a local church ought to be thinking about in the context of its public witness being. So, and I'm making just kind of a scratch in the desk progress on that. One place I look a lot is in 1 Peter, which is a pretty common passage, 1 Peter 2, where there's a passage about churches, people of God in government and the relationship to the emperor and honoring the emperor and that kind of stuff. One really fantastic insight I gleaned from a scholar named Tom Schreiner at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville. He has a commentary on 1 Peter, and he observes there a shift from chapter 1 into chapter 2, where the chapter 1 directives are basically aimed at you and I as individuals, how we ought to treat one another inside the body. So there's an individualistic take on it. But then somewhere around verse 122 and forward, it pivots to a plural you. We don't pick up that in the English language automatically. But from then on through chapter 2, all of the directives are aimed at us as an ecclesiastic body, as a people of God. And it gets in there. Royal priesthood, holy nation. Once you were not a people, now you are a people. They're all plural communal descriptors. And I think there's some stuff to mine in that, and maybe some other, and presumably other places in Scripture, where you can say, look, what is a local church as a gathered body? What are our obligations that we can hold to, that then instruct how we present a public witness? And so there are some passages in that so that Gentiles will glorify God on the day of the Lord. There's a lot in there, a lot to unpack. I'm a newbie theologian. I'm not going to if I get hate mail, please just make it nice. But this is where I'm going with a hypothesis. Is what in Scripture can we root the local church witness in the context of a liberal democracy?
I love it. I'm fascinated by that. Very fascinated by it. Where are you at in your PhD studies so far?
Very early.
Oh, really? Okay.
I did some prereqs between DC and Nashville. I did move-wise. Did some prereqs, and then I've completed one semester of my coursework.
Okay,
so
gotcha.
I'm a newbie.
You have another 3-4 years, you think?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah. At least 3 years, probably plus the dissertation.
Yeah. Well, what motivates that, or how do you think about politics and faith? I mean, I guess what do you believe to be true about it for you to get involved and have a desire to get involved and push the ball forward? Do you believe that eventually we can just sort of, Christians can kind of take it all over? Or do you believe that maybe not that, but no matter what, who, at any time, there needs to be people advocating for these things? What do you believe to be true about that, to have this desire to be involved in politics, in policy as a believer in Christ?
Yeah. I think I have probably at least 3 answers to that. I think 2 of the things that prompt me, pardon me, 2 of the things that prompt me to get involved are, number one, seeing it done so poorly so often. Number 2, seeing that even among our best theologians, our best public theologians, people I would name and highly recommend to you, there's a gulf between the theology and the practice. So even our friends on Capitol Hill, who were like part of our religious tribe, who were Southern Baptists, who were kind of theology nerds, who loved reading, obviously Russell Moore, but also a lot of the other evangelical heavyweights who write about church and politics. There's a gulf between what even when they're reading and seeking out, theologians to give them guidance, there's a gulf between the theory and the practice. So any opportunity I can have to smush those worlds together, I'd love to do that. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, what I started to notice among all of our public theologians, or most of the books I've read on public theology, and a lot of great ones, a lot of that have taught me well, is how individualistic the application is. It's always for the Christian individual. And I'm talking about kind of what I call an intellectual lineage of, say, C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and Chuck Colson, as far as like this orbit of Christians in the public square. It kind of, once I saw it, I kind of can't unsee it. But there's very little for a local church as an institution to draw on. You can give your members resources, and our biblical ethicists have been doing tons of work for decades about what we Christians ought to believe, or could ought to believe, or ought to disagree about in good faith, on a whole host of issues, A to Z. But then, say, given an issue, say a church comes to a conviction about abortion, say a church comes to a conviction about immigration, how then best does a local church advance that conviction in the public square? We don't have anything that instructs a church in a meaningful way. You have the rule book from the IRS. Mm-hmm. You have the Western individualism rule book, which says politics is my thing. Don't touch it. Don't talk to me about don't challenge my political views. In a way that we rebel even against our pastors, even when our pastors might say gently, you maybe ought to think about this a little differently. Mm-hmm. Like, no, it's my politics. Mm-hmm. So those were the things I was seeing.
Yeah.
As far as what it ought to be, I think the goal is, or the theme that we ought to take on, is a faithful and fruitful political witness. Faithful in that it's faithful to doctrine, faithful to Scripture, faithful to the local body. Your body might be divided on issues A, B, and C, but might be united on X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And just because you're divided on A, B, and C doesn't make you ought to be no commitment to be mute on issues X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. Just like certain ministries feel a passion to get engaged on the soup kitchen, or the orphan and widow ministry, or addiction recovery. Not every church does the same mission, right? A lot of them do the similar. A lot of those ministries, you can more or less go to a Christian bookstore or online and buy kind of the ministry in the box, and it'll show you how to do this faithfully. That's appropriate for the local church. Christian counseling, we do this. Christian education, right? We all build this on incorporating sound principles from the world, but rooting it in this ultimately. We do this for everything else. We don't do it for politics.
Interesting.
And so faithful and fruitful, or faithful in that respect to doctrine and to the local body. In the grander denominational context, it would be the ERLC faithful to doctrine, faithful to the consensus of the convention. So some of this I'm backwards engineering from a denominational perspective to a local church. Faithful and fruitful. Fruitful is important because one of the most common question I got to anybody who visited our DC office, pastors, church leaders, Southern Baptists who were just passing through on vacation, student groups, was, how effective are you? It's a great question. We should hope to be effective in representing our particular body of believers in the public square. I think but the problem with the effective question is you immediately get drawn into issues of pragmatism, which might be from time to time wise, prudential, strategic, but pragmatism can never guide the Christian church, right? We've seen errors on pragmatism for church growth movements. We've seen errors in pragmatism for missions. We see errors in just evangelism in general. Mm-hmm. If you go purely pragmatic, that can get you into all kinds of terrible territory. If it's fruitful, number one, you're trying to be effective, but you're also mindful that your reason for being there in the public square is not only to be effective policy wonks in our case. Your reason for existing in the public square is to provide a witness to the kingdom of God. And so the how tends to matter when you engage the public square, whether it's on social media or whether it's on Capitol Hill, because people are watching. Whether they're watching on social media, whether they're watching you on being a talking head on the news channel, whether they're watching you in a meeting on Capitol Hill. Members of Congress are watching, staffers are watching, non-Christian NGOs are watching, and how you do what you do in your local community as a local church also matters. I think that component about how we engage politics, we just don't have.
Yeah.
Very few people have developed it.
No, I think you're totally right. And I think I'm just so fascinated by it. I feel like it's a space where I don't hear much about, haven't heard much about, don't know much about, but you're totally right. There's a gap there. But I really appreciate your point about there's a danger by getting too pragmatic with the policy stuff, because you're totally right. Like, we see how we're missing the point when we get pragmatic with evangelism or the way we do church, like those types of things. You can't program the work of the Lord. Right. And yet over here on the policy side, I guess I would have been thinking a little bit more like them. Like, how's it going? How effective? Are you guys effective? Yeah. You know?
And it's a fair question entirely.
Yeah, sure.
But as an ecclesiastic body, there's more to it.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I'm going to ask you a question, which is definitely painting with broad strokes here. It's categorization. This is not going to be correct for a whole lot of people. I don't really know how else to phrase it. You might even disagree with the premise. It seems to me, broad strokes here, a more Baptist or maybe dispensational theology is maybe pays a little bit more attention to abortion, and a more Presbyterian covenantal theology maybe pays a little bit more attention to social justice issues, which one could argue abortion is a social justice issue, but maybe particularly related to social justice and race. Would you agree with that in any capacity?
Yeah.
And if so, where do you think that comes from?
I think I'm with you on the nuance of language. For shorthand, for the sake of this conversation, don't at me on Twitter. I think it's right to I would describe them as kind of churches with an emphasis on righteousness, churches with an emphasis on justice, and again, imperfect definitions. But there are churches where, like I think you indicated, a pastor can get up on a Sunday morning and preach very specifically about abortion, and the church will love it, and no one will go from flat for it. Some people might quietly be disgruntled, but they already know that about their church. Take another church. Again, very similar statements of faith. Different cultural context, different political community. A pastor can preach on immigration and refugee ministry, and the church will love him for it. And either pastor will get, I was going to say crucified, but that's exaggerated. Blasted to no end if they, if the righteousness pastor hits, preaches directly on a justice topic, or if a justice pastor of a justice-minded congregation preaches on abortion from a pro-life perspective. This happens frequently, and I think pastors feel that. My challenge is not to berate either of them, or I'd never want to tell a pastor what to do, even as an advocate. I want to help them do what they already feel they want to do, but nobody's given them the tools. I do feel that divide, and that's why I think we need some strategies for developing the political consciences of our congregations, of our members, because they ought to care about both.
Sure. Yeah.
And my challenge to my progressive friends or churches that are probably more a part of this kind of they're more friendly to the justice branded issues. This is my words for my righteousness minded colleagues. Political conservatives probably who are all about abortion policy. Justice is a biblical term. I will argue that there's a definition of social justice that's in Scripture. All kinds of stuff. I mean, we talked about it in the Peter passage, but certainly in the Old Testament, we're talking about people as a people, a plurality, a community. Justice is a biblical word. I think even the classic the Chronicles passage that if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray, that's been used to an application to what Christians in America ought to do. If my people, that's a communal thing. It's plural. Humble themselves and pray. I will seek to heal their plural land, which is a plurality. However you interpret that. So even in that phrase, even that verse, that's very popular among brothers and sisters of mine and churches I've been a part of on this kind of the righteousness bent churches that we've defined for this conversation. That's a social justice verse. I'm sorry. You could go on. What they often attribute to the justice congregations is it's a conflation of terminology. So political lefts have used the social justice thing for decades now, and it's associated with a lot of leftist political theory and stuff. And there's critique to be had there. But when our brothers and sisters in the righteousness or the justice congregations use it, often it's very biblical and it's accurate. But we've been so, again, influenced by the media.
Right.
And the political realm as individuals that we hear social justice and we say, no, that's not biblical. That's leftist political propaganda.
Right.
The words are different, or the words are the same, but the context is often accurate.
Yes.
And frankly, look, there's some church history on the political left and progressive theologians where there's a history of mainline Protestant churches supporting leftist political uprisings around the globe. That's a pretty well documented history. So we don't come to that necessarily by complete fault. But again, because we have obligations to one another to listen to our brothers and sisters and to read Scripture and apply it, we can't be pitting biblical principles against one another.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it has as much to do with our understanding. Maybe it has as much to do with importing political viewpoints as it does to our particular theology. Maybe even more to do with importing our cultural political viewpoints than it does to. It's not like one theology tends towards one or maybe the other. Maybe it's just the camps tend to import a particular type of political ideation.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's again, these are decades of trend lines in the making. I think a lot of it it's a matter of emphasis. Number one, it's what have we been doing in our churches? Yeah, like that all of us. It seems all of a sudden we have this discrepancy. Yeah. Well, all these trends have been. It's because of the steady diet of whatever we've been doing in church, however we've been doing it. Yeah. It tends to, if we're not making church about Jesus and what he did on the cross and resurrected, if we allow ourselves to make church about the other stuff we share in common, the affinity group stuff, that tends to become more important than the gospel, which has implications for all of life,
absolutely,
for justice and righteousness.
Yes,
often often in Scripture they're hinged at the hip, or even in the context of one word.
Yeah.
They're together, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think that's why I'm concerned about the local church cultivating political consciences of our members first. So here's another way to look at my project. We gripe all the time about the church. Politically, maybe the church is silent. Maybe the church is errant. Maybe the church supported a president. Maybe the church shouldn't have supported a president. The church is slow. The church is fill in the blank. What we typically mean by that is this church universal, right? This kind of, and usually it's in the American context, it's whatever the church is. It's this universal expression of the church, which is true. It's a biblical use of the term. But then all of our application, especially in politics, is all individualistic. And so my challenge to people who want to gripe about the political witness or anything about the church is show me tips and tricks for the local body. Because we criticize the church here. We give tips and tricks to the individual down here. But how do we critique the church collectively without providing support and direction for a local church?
Yeah.
On what fill in the blank.
Yeah.
It could be missiology. It could be civic engagement. It could be any of the things we already talked about. It could be did I say evangelism? It could be on a whole host of things. But if we lob, this is easy. Critiquing the church universal is easy because there's no person, there's no institution.
That's right. There's no one church.
There's no one church.
Yeah.
And frankly, the critique might be right. I've done it myself. But we need to provide solutions for local church bodies and pastors.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's an issue of ecclesiology. So if you have a church that is so influenced by Western individualism that it doesn't see its pastor as an authority responsible for their souls,
right,
that's a problem.
Yeah.
And a pastor is going to have natural problems, not just in politics, but any kind of issue where it requires a pastor to kind of prick the conscience.
Yes, that Western individualism is what will prompt you to walk out when your pastor says something that makes you uncomfortable.
Right.
What you're saying in that moment is, you can be my pastor as long as you don't ruffle my feathers, as long as I agree with you, everything's good. Sure, you can be my pastor, but if we cross a line, I'm going to walk out.
Right.
And
for those of us in a congregational model, like we're predisposed, I think, to that tendency.
Yeah.
Because we hired the pastor. You work for us.
Oh, yeah. Good point. Yeah.
That's scripturally, I affirm the local body and the consensus and all that goes with Baptist life.
Yeah.
But that model, coupled with this Western individualism that we all presume and don't think about and don't recognize, that creates a lot of problems in our ecclesiology.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Crossing Faiths podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got this going right now.
I do. CrossingFaiths.com.
Yeah. Okay. CrossingFaiths.com.
Yeah.
It's you and a Muslim friend.
It is.
John Pinna. Okay.
Yes.
How did this come to be and what are you guys into?
I'll reverse the answer. We are into a Christian and Muslim talking religion and politics, which we think is a unique shtick.
It's very unique.
It might be a little too unique to find a growing audience, but we think it's unique. We don't see anybody else doing it.
Yeah.
We want to be humble about it, so we're not saying it's the Christian Muslim, but
right.
we are saying it's the first because we haven't seen any evangelical partner with a Muslim to do in-depth, all the time, weekly podcast. We do see Christians and pastors and imams joining forces to have an event, a conversation, but an ongoing kind of dialogue we didn't really see. Where it came from was John was somebody I met on Capitol Hill, and we advocated together on what? International religious liberty. And in the context of policy advocacy, we became friends. And we became friends in a way that we got to use each other to explain our respective tribes. So I would have a Muslim question. I'd be like, John, explain this to me. And he would come to me, Matt, I saw this poll about evangelicals. What in the world does this mean?
Oh, wow.
And so we were able to use each other basically as a safe space to better understand his world and my world. And so, which frankly is one talking point I meant to reflect back on your earlier question about righteousness and justice congregations is a lot of this has to do with translations. So a lot of our work in Capitol Hill was translating. Even though we think we're speaking the same English language, we're not. The United States is far, even the local church, I think, is far more diverse than we think it is with respect to how we talk and how we think about things. And so one of the things I appreciated with John is that we're kind of always in a constant state of translation. We're always trying to be like, wait a minute, you use that phrase, it doesn't sound like the same phrase that I use. You're using it differently. Explain that to me. And likewise. And so this basically, the podcast is just us dragging our friendly conversations into the public.
Yeah.
That often were awkward. We frankly, we agree on a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we don't agree on a whole lot.
Sure.
And his joke to me on an earlier episode was, are you trying to what was it? Are you trying to evangelize me?
I was just going to ask if both you guys are concerned about the other trying to convert.
Yeah. To which I answered, always.
That is the correct answer,
It's the correct answer. And so when you have a Christian and a Muslim who can talk about things like evangelism versus proselytization versus changing the faith, we think that's a unique conversation to have. And then in context of going back to Paul D. Miller's tweet, we think we have our pet topics that we love to talk about that you'll hear on the podcast. A lot of it has to do with religion and public policy, religion and foreign policy. We have our bailiwicks on those issues. And we have very obviously strong opinions on religion and politics.
Mm-hmm.
But the point of the podcast, the not so not so hidden point of the podcast, is to model these conversations in public.
Okay.
Which I think is what we need. So if we're doing that, like, oh, Matt's an evangelical. I know his game. Oh, he can talk with a Muslim about religion and politics of all things and still be friends?
Yeah.
And still explain the Bible or still talk about the Bible and Jesus Christ the way I would and not pull any punches?
Mm-hmm.
And they still walk away friends and they keep getting in front of the microphone week after week? Huh. That's what I want the takeaway to be.
Yeah, maybe I can have that conversation with my Muslim neighbor. Exactly. You know what I mean? They're doing it. Now maybe I can do that. Yeah, I love that so much, particularly or especially in this day and age with all of the polarization and everything that's going on. I think it's, I really commend you for that. How long ago did you start this and how's it going?
Almost a year ago.
Oh, wow.
So we're technically, we break them up into seasons or whatever.
Oh, okay.
But
you have breaks every so
we
often?
have breaks every so often.
Oh,
so we'll probably have a summer break coming up.
Okay.
Because I like doing the weekly podcast, but it's a pace of life thing too. I mean, you've got to take breaks, and he's got Ramadan, I've got Christmas, and
sure, yeah. What is his career? What is his line of work?
He's done a lot of different things. He's got a pretty fantastic biography. He used to lead an organization. We met in the context of him leading an organization where he was a director of international and government relations for American Islamic Congress, which is one of several Muslim kind of think tank advocacy organizations that started early in the 21st century, particularly post 9/11. And he's a veteran. He still serves as what's the term? He still serves with the National Guard.
I see.
Apparently, frequently. He's a military veteran. He's done a lot of development work on U.S. government contracts. So he's helped build schools in Afghanistan. He and his organization did a lot kind of in the lead up to what was then called the the Arab Spring, that ended up not going the way everybody anticipated. But he's done a lot of creative things. So he's an advocate. He's got a lot of experience doing government grants and that kind of thing. And he still works on international religious freedom issues, not as heavily as he and I did when we were in D.C. at the same time. But he's still got that foot in the water, and he's about to launch a new organization called Muslims for Muslims, which is, I would have to let him explain it. So come listen to our Crossing Faiths podcast to get the full story. We haven't talked about it yet, but it's kind of on the cusp of that he's trying to set apart from a lot of other Muslim advocacy groups. Yeah. And he's doing a lot of interesting things, and he's a believer in the multi-faith approach, which is different we describe as different than the interfaith approach, if you want to get into that rabbit trail. But there's, we believe that religious people of religion, different faiths, can come together, collaborate, and ought to for the sake of their communities. But there's a way you do that that respects people's faiths and who they are, and don't make themselves check their identity at the door when they come to, say, at the dialogue table, right?
Sure.
So if John's going to come dialogue with me as a Christian on public issues, I shouldn't expect him to cease being Muslim or withhold his Muslim identity at the door before coming in.
Okay.
So in a way that would be unrecognizable to his Muslim community. Right?
Sure.
Same thing for a Jewish person engaging the space. And I think there's a real lack of theologically conservative Christians in particular, but also other religious groups that don't participate in the public square with other faiths, because a lot of what happens in, quote, the interfaith model is that people who want to kind of look where their faiths look alike, they want to downplay differences.
Sure.
It tends towards universalists and liberal progressives or liberal theologians within the phase. They get together pretty easily. It's harder to get people who have exclusive religious beliefs and admit they're exclusive together in the room to collaborate. And then you have different models. That's the secularization model, which will allow religious people to get together, but only talk about secular things, which means I can come and collaborate with a Muslim and a Jew on, say, clean water projects, but we can't talk about anything theological.
Right.
Both the interfaith model and the secularization model, I think, are problematic for a lot of different reasons. It's a rabbit trail for another time. Come to Crossing Faiths, we talk about it frequently. Yeah. But the multi-faith model respects differences, recognizes we're still neighbors, and oftentimes, because of our faiths, need to and ought to interact with each other.
Yeah, I love that. CrossingFaiths.com. And how do you use Skype? Do you Zoom? How do you? Because he's in New York City, right?
Yeah. Well, he's either in DC or upstate New York. He's from New York.
Okay.
He is from New York City.
Where upstate? Do you know?
Poughkeepsie.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool.
And we frequently have conversations about Poughkeepsie.
Yeah.
and its pronunciation up there in the Hudson Valley.
Yeah.
But he's from New York, so often his New York personality is probably overshadowing his Muslim personality. I think I can say that, John. You don't mind me saying that?
I think any decent New York personality is going to overshadow some things. That's one of the things I love about New Yorkers, man. Jerseyites. I mean,
we do it from Skype. We've been doing it from Skype right now.
Okay.
We're flirting with the idea of moving it to YouTube and doing some video stuff. So we'll see how that works out.
Totally
I don't have the bandwidth or the gear to time to edit video, so we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
But, if we can throw it up live and make something of it, have a little more fun.
Yeah,
that'd be cool.
What? You have been in the podcast, so you've been involved with a number of podcasts, is my understanding.
Yeah.
You've produced some, you've been involved with some. What have you seen, where have you seen the podcasting space go in the last few years? Where do you see it going?
I think it's, number one, it's gone from a niche kind of nerddom listenership to mainstream. If my family and my wife are listening to podcasts, like that's gone mainstream. I've been listening to podcasts since the early 2000s. I mean, we technically were delivering our radio program with the Southern Baptist ERLC, via the podcast technology as early as like 2003. It was like pre-iPhone. Didn't have a huge audience at all, but like we were using the technology. So the technology's been around for 2 decades. So to see it flourish and to jump into kind of the mainstream mindset, I think that's the biggest deal. It also means that everybody's podcasting, and so it's harder. It's very cheap to do, very very cheap to get into. Not necessarily cheap to do well, but it's cheap to get into. The barrier to entry is low, but the competition is sky high, and so those are kind of the main themes. But like Paul Miller said, I love podcasts because you can have some in-depth conversations. There's a lot of variety of podcasts. So I've consulted with some folks who were institutions that were considering doing a podcast, and they're trying to figure it out. So I'm like, well, here's the landscape. Here's what you can do. Here's what you could do for this much money. Here's what you could do for this much money.
Right.
This is what you're going to forget about because you're not in broadcasting communications.
Yeah.
These are the things you have to keep in contact.
Yep.
Sorry, my wife, I turned off my notifications, but my wife has the VIP status.
Oh,
so
really?
It still
so
rings,
we know that's a call from your wife. You can get it if you need to.
Anyway, so, I mean, I love long form podcasts like this because you can have in-depth conversations. But there are also some really well-produced podcasts that like people listen to Serial and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I haven't been drawn in necessarily to the crime drama podcast, but those kinds of things, the highly produced things, do exist. There, you get into those highly produced stuff can get really laborious time-wise.
For sure.
Have some really tech stuff, tech know-how.
Yeah.
So it's pretty exciting what things are going to do. I'm really excited that Apple in particular really hasn't messed with the delivery of podcasts through its medium. I think if they had done that years ago, tried to make it proprietary or tried to like really weigh heavy. It's still a standard bearer, don't get me wrong, but like there's a way that Apple in particular could have weighed in on the podcast scene early in a way that really would have been detrimental to growth and creativity, I think.
Interesting.
There's some people who are, Spotify bought, a bunch of podcasts and are doing that now. I think it's a pretty exciting time. But I think I really am interested in helping from time to time institutions who think, hey, we want to do a podcast. I want to get in the podcasting game.
Yeah.
Some organizations should. Some organizations shouldn't.
Yeah.
Some organizations should but don't know how.
Yep.
And don't know that they don't know how. And some organizations think that they shouldn't, but really should.
Yeah.
Right? But that takes some skill. It's not, the microphones and the recording, that's like the easy part.
Right.
And if you're thinking through it institutionally, which was what I did for the ERLC for a long time, it's a different ballgame when you're trying to present an institution. Because doing a podcast or any kind of broadcast sort of thing, you can really get into mission drift pretty quickly. Or you can create a beast that you haven't staffed up to support.
Yes.
And so there are a lot of scenarios in which podcasting for an institution is very different than podcasting for an individual or an upstart.
Sure. Yeah. Who are you paying attention to? Who are you learning from? What podcasts you listening to? Where do you get your news?
Yeah, sure. I do use Twitter, to your earlier question about for news and information and op-eds that people are writing. Really excited about what the Dispatch is doing. It's a new media venture from folks that were formerly at National Review Online. And
the Dispatch.
The Jonah Goldberg and blanking on some of their other names. David French is over there now. They're trying to do a new media model, which a lot of it is you have to pay for. They're looking for listener viewer supported model of news media, but they're trying to do their perspective is right of center, but they're trying really hard to be fact based and call balls and strikes in their news reporting. I like people like Paul Miller, who is an expert in say foreign policy, and you start to get a sense of things that of people who are credible, and part of credibility is knowing when not to make comments, right? When people know the limit of their expertise,
right?
And so I'm attracted to people like Paul, people at the Dispatch. I like to listen to podcasts where I don't agree with everything that they're throwing down. Alec Baldwin's got a podcast called "Here's the Thing," and a lot of times he's interviewing people from the arts, people from politics, and a lot of times I don't agree with the politics in particular, but it always teaches me something, and that's one thing. And I not only teaches me something, it helps me learn how people who I don't necessarily agree with talk about things, about the same things I care about. Yeah. It cues me into the lingo, cues me into some of the history of stuff. And then one thing, I try to, and again, these are kind of cyclical. I don't do all this stuff all the time.
Right.
I kind of get in seasons. Sometimes I just need to listen to music.
Right. Me too.
Sometimes I'm kind of hungry for audible conversation.
Yep.
I could go through my my podcast list. There's a lot of them. One thing I liked early on in my career was looking outside my own industry for inspiration. A particular example is that I used to read Wired magazine all the time. It's a tech industry mag, and I was in broadcasting with a southern, a denominational entity.
Right.
Not a whole lot of inspiration,
Yeah.
or not a whole lot of synergy necessarily between those two spaces. Yeah. But it gets you out of your headspace. It gets you, I think, intellectually and creatively engaged in learning something about a different field and learning about something new. Doesn't rarely, have direct application, but I think it's a good exercise.
Yeah.
Intellectually, that's been helpful for me. Things I've been reading lately, mostly it's all public theology stuff.
Okay.
Bruce Ashford is my major professor at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. It's the one based in Wake Forest, North Carolina. Bruce Ashford is really sharp on things of public theology. Part of the reason I'm studying with him is because we were observing particularly the earlier critique of theologians kind of being detached from the practitioners of public policy. He was making that observation from the scholarly realm, and I was making it from the practitioner realm, and we seem to agree at that disconnect, or kind of in that gulf. So I'm reading. I tap into what other people are listening to, who I respect, and see what kind of things they do. So to hit through my random podcast listening thing here, David Axelrod is a longtime political Democrat political strategist. He has a podcast called The Axe Files. Again, I don't always agree with him, but he does have on conservative guests too, and so he's someone who, with him, he's always kind of got a partisan jab, occasionally subtle, but it's really downplayed. Yeah. And he's, I think, particularly given someone his political background and weight, to have conversations across the aisle, I think is really fruitful, particularly given our particular political moment and our terrible public discourse. Commentary Magazine has a pretty fantastic podcast. It's basically a political conservative Jewish magazine. Coming out from the Jewish community, the authors and everything aren't all Jewish, but that's kind of where it comes out of. Let's see. The World and Everything in It from World News Group, the publishers of World Magazine. Especially they have a segment called Legal Docket that explains legal court issues in ways that we normal people can understand, aren't attorneys. Let's see. The ERLC podcast I still listen to. They have two of them. Capital Conversations, which is the one I used to host for them, which is all about the DC office and the DC staff there.
I see.
Which was a lot of fun. I did that for 4 years. If you want to step out of your comfort zone, Evangelical Christians, People of the Pod is a Jewish podcast that talks about the Jewish people and politics, both domestically and internationally. The Long Game by John Ward is fantastic. Check out The Long Game by John Ward. He's a political writer. The Long Game is all about what it's going to take to rebuild American institutions and confidence in American institutions. And it is really the long game. So I jive with a lot of what he's throwing down. Let's see, what else? There's kind of things in my...
Yeah. Do you get the newspaper?
I do not get the newspaper.
You don't? Okay.
I also, flag one more.
Yeah.
Pass the mic.
I've heard of that one.
It's done by Witness. The Witness, it's a collective. It's an African-American collective. And for me as a white guy, it allows me to listen in on topics of race from an African-American Christian perspective. And that has helped me a lot.
Pass the mic.
When I just need to listen and learn.
Yeah.
So check out Pass the Mic. It's a good place to, and again, just listen.
Yeah.
Listen and sleep on it. If you want to hear our African-American brothers and sisters talking about issues of race from a theologically conservative perspective, in a way that ought to prick our consciences, listen to Pass the Mic.
Oh, excellent. So if you don't get the newspaper, are you going to Google News every morning? Are you going on the internet? Or are you just using Twitter for that? And you can tell it'll be done soon too.
Sorry about that. Family's texting.
Oh yeah, no, don't worry about it.
Sorry about that.
I can let you go very quickly too.
One second. Okay, sorry about that.
No worries.
Of course, the news. One of those things that you kind of develop a knack for, and I think I would encourage that I developed a knack for in kind of the DC public policy arena, is we really need to get attuned to the difference between straight reporting and opinion. I think we've been really the noise, to go back to an earlier theme, has been really part of the problem is we don't see the difference between straight news reporting and opinion pieces. And frankly, the media institutions haven't done a great job of separating those. Mm-hmm. And frankly, you know, everything we learned about news media bias, we learned from Bernard Goldberg's book like 20 years ago called Bias. You know, bias was kind of the precursor to the fake news thing. Nobody trusted because of the bias, and instead of correcting the bias, some organizations kind of doubled down on what they were believing. And so I think Christians in this environment, one of the best things we can do for each other is to help each other develop kind of a knack for credibility. Like what's credible? Like what are credible institutions? What are credible authors? Sometimes you're going to have to set the media institution aside and seek out the reporter, the journalist, like journalist singular, who even though you might quibble sometimes and you're not crazy about it, nobody's going to get it perfect 100% of the time. They're doing the best to just serve up straight facts. And in the case of op-ed people, we need to read, and we need to people respect our tribe, and I think highlight people we agree with who are not throwing down partisan talking points, who are being honest about their predispositions, about their presuppositions. Nobody's going to be completely objective, but you can be candid about your presuppositions and your biases. You say, this is where I'm coming from. This is why I'm coming. This is how I'm going to cover it. This is how I'm going to talk about it. Instead of like the veil of some supposed objectivity that's really not going to pan out. Or that really isn't true, isn't accurate. Nobody's going to be objective. So the best thing is to identify our biases. And I think we ought to stretch ourselves by reading and listening to people who don't share our point of view. Yeah. And to the extent that we've not done that for whatever reason, I think it's a problem. We need not fear people changing our minds from that. For anything, being exposed to people who think differently from me has strengthened my own convictions, or made me articulate them differently. Those are two very valuable outcomes from interacting with people who don't share your worldview. Yeah, I did a master's in philosophy in a secular state institution as an evangelical Christian, and I still believe that Jesus raised from the dead. Right. But it helped me communicate my beliefs to a greater orbit of people. Right. And it helped attune my understanding of different arguments that I would see in the public square, filtered down to the policy level, as far as like where those things are coming from philosophically. Yeah. And so that was my particular thing. Doesn't mean anybody listening to this podcast needs to go get a philosophy degree, heaven forbid. Yep. But to the point where you can like seek out, like if you're a left of center person, politically speaking, check out folks at the Dispatch, check out people at Commentary. You're not going to agree with everything, but they're saying most of the time credible, most of the time saying credible people who aren't in it for the clicks. and are in it for the clickbait advertising to make you angry so that you click or forward something.
Right.
And if you're a right of center kind of person, pick out something, pick out some folks that you don't necessarily listen to or listen to from the political left.
Yeah.
Like, David Axelrod.
Yeah.
And you're not going to agree with them. That's okay.
Yeah.
But you at least need to be able to learn and hear a dialogue with people who don't disagree or don't agree on a lot.
Yeah, totally. Well, I'll let you go, Matthew. This was a real pleasure. I really enjoyed getting to know you better in the last couple hours, and thank you so much for coming on. It's just really great. I think it'll be very helpful.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Happy to do it.
Well, might need to invite you again at some point, but because there's a lot here we didn't cover. I usually have like 3 or 4 points, and I have like 9, so I didn't figure we'd get to it all, which is fine. But anyhow, in closing, any kind of word of advice you'd want to leave with the listeners in this religion politics space? Yeah. Anything come to mind?
Shake off everything you know about religion and politics. I will say in this particular moment, we as Christians need to have faith in the place where our faith ought to be rooted, and that's in the kingdom of Christ, and expressed currently through their church. Whatever you think about our current political problems, whether you get fired up and want to get Trump out of office in the fall, whether you're fired up about the riots in the streets, we need to be able to engage one another as brothers and sisters in Christ about political issues in a way that respects each other, first as human beings, secondly as brothers and sisters in Christ, and that affirms our obligations to each other, one to another, and then both camps. Whatever our political problems are right now as a nation, they came about from decades of bad trend lines. We're not going to pull out of it in an election cycle or two. This is a long game, a healing process. It's a harder thing to build than it is to pull down. So to the extent that you care about the self-government project in the United States, wherever you fall politically, engage for the long game, engage with one another as brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah, well said. All right, Matthew Hawkins, thank you so much.
Thanks,
appreciate it.